Well, hello, happy December. It is officially the holiday season. Welcome to Crime Dive. My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself drawn to these true crime cases. So that's what to talk about. If you like true crime, and you also want to feel better about your makeup skills, you should absolutely like, subscribe, and let's hang out together every Tuesday where I will take a deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on the old clown paint. Yes, it's the holiday season. It is upon us. I, as you can see, updated the set just a little bit. Nothing too fancy or anything. I got a little miniature Santa hat here for Fang. I thought that was super cute. But yeah, just wanted to update the set for the holiday season. I don't know if you can see my shitters full sign. I don't know if you guys like Christmas Vacation, but that is totally a staple Christmas movie in our household. So yeah, let me know. I mean, obviously Christmas is far from the only holiday in December, so let me know if you don't celebrate Christmas, what do you celebrate? Do you celebrate multiple holidays? What do you guys do? Let me know. I'm totally curious to know. All right, well, enough of that. Let's talk about today's case. And I'm laughing because I don't know if you guys are gonna love me or hate me, but yes, we are gonna venture on the first three-parter. I know, three-parter, I know. So this case, which was a recommended case, just really sucked me in. I think I can easily say, out of all the true crime cases I have covered so far this year, this one I think had me, I don't know what word to use, hooked, drawn in, just obsessed. I don't know how to describe it, but just the more you peel away with this case, the more I was just so intrigued and I couldn't get enough. So today we will be talking about the case of Tom Capano. Yeah, have you heard of this case? Like I said, this was a requested case, and it was requested by Tyler Manter. Thank you so much, Tyler, for yet another great recommendation. And thank you for sending me a case that has an awesome book written about it. It is actually Spladow, my second and rule book, all right? And it was called I Never Let Her Go, all right? And this book, you guys, I was so hooked and drawn into this case. And this book, hands down, gotta be one of, if not my favorite true crime book that I have. I really enjoyed this, and this is where, yeah, I got a good bulk of the information for today's case. So like I said, man, yeah, three-parter, y'all. And now look, here, I like to do deep dives, all right? Because when I get into true crime cases and I'm researching it, I like to get every single detail. Not only are these human beings that we're dealing with, that this stuff happens to, these aren't characters in a book or in a show or something, right? These are real life human beings. So not only do, I want to dig more into details and just sort of dig more into that and seeing who these people were as humans, but so many of these cases have nuance, right? And complexities. And sometimes, man, you cannot boil that down into 10 or 15 minutes. And I don't know, I guess I'm nosy or something. I don't know. I gotta keep digging. And this has an over 600 page book accompanied with it. So this case just really drew me in, and there's so many details. So yeah, as we go through, yeah, you'll probably think these are some details I could have omitted, but like I said, man, part of, what I do here is going into super deep dives, and I try to facilitate, sort of that feel that you're kind of sitting down with your friends and you're just kind of discussing this, right? Discussing about current events. And in this case, we're talking about true crime cases. And when I tell these details in my videos, these are, details that I would be talking about with, friends or something, So yeah, there's so much to get into, so much. So yeah, that's why I decided to break it into three parts. Yeah, 3 parts. Disclaimer wise, especially since this is part 1, so we're basically going to be introduced to, Tom Capano, obviously, and our victim in today's case, Marie. So mostly today is going to be sort of about background, who these people were, how they met, and we're going to get into Tom and Anne's relationship, all right? We will be talking about some serious issues, Anne did struggle with an eating disorder and body image issues and stuff like that. So like that, generic topic will be brought up. So there's a lot to get into. Let's go ahead and start, y'all. Let's talk about this case of Tom Capano. So Tommy Joseph Capano was born October 11th, 1949, and his father, Louis Capano Sr., was an Italian immigrant and a carpenter. And his mother was named Marguerite Moglione, or maybe Moglione. I tried finding pronunciations for some of these names, and y'all, I couldn't find, I found variations of names that were close to them, but not the actual name, so I'm doing my best here. Now, like I said, Louis Sr. was a carpenter, and he had actually served 4 years as an apprentice before he could join the union for carpenters. And then he was hired on by the Cantera Construction Company. And here he worked very long, hard hours to provide for his family. And it's during his apprenticeship that Louis met Thomas's mother, Marguerite. The couple were barely 20 years old, very, very poor, when they got married. They wanted to have as many children as, quote, God sent them. Their first child was a daughter named Marion, who was born in 1944. And then 5 years later came Tom. Then came Louis Jr., who was born in 1951. And then Joseph came in 1952. Now, Tom was very close with his brothers. They had a very tight bond, though it is said all of their personalities and stuff were extraordinarily different. But despite that, they were very close. So when the oldest, Marion, was 3 years old, Louis Sr. went into business with a friend, Emilio Capaldi, and they formed the Consolidated Construction Company. Their company specialized in store and office, construction, remodeling, renovations, that kind of thing. That's what they specialized in. Marguerite was a stay-at-home wife and mother. She didn't really, know anything about business or anything like that. The home was really her domain, and she was described as, quote, one tough cookie. Although I'm wondering if maybe that wasn't a PC way of maybe calling her a little bit of a biatch. Apparently one time, Louis Jr. was being an anti-Semitic a-hole to a Jewish kid, and when the kid's mother called Marguerite to complain and be hey, your son's being a little bit of an anti-Semitic prick, it said Marguerite just said, quote, well, my kids get called wops and guineas. He should toughen up. How about no, Marguerite? How about no? Now, after World War II and the GI Bill, where, housing was really booming, we had, the creation of suburbs and stuff as we know them, the construction company really took off. They changed the name of the company to Capaldi and Capano, and they began building homes for the influx of people and families who flocked to the area. It was a booming time for the business. Emilio would draw the blueprints, the architectural plans, and planned everything out, while Louis Sr. oversaw the jobs and kind of the day-to-day tasks, keeping and running the company day to day. And as it turns out, Capaldi and Capano ended up building most of the houses that sprung up in and around the Wilmington, Delaware area. Yeah, Delaware, that is where we are at today. And it is said these guys did not cut corners and never sacrificed their quality. It was said Louis was an artisan and he would refuse to cut corners or cheap out on stuff, you know what I mean? He really cared about his trade, so he never did anything half-assed. And it was due to this high quality, attention to detail, and reputation for being honest that built both Louis and Emilio's reputation. It is said Louis could make deals worth hundreds of thousands of dollars on a handshake alone. And it wasn't long before Capaldi and Capano had a reputation for building stellar, high quality, highly sought after properties. And soon everyone wanted Capaldi and Capano to build for them and build their homes. It is said the homes built by them actually jumped up thousands of dollars in value just for the mere fact that they were built by Capaldi and Capano. Yeah, they were that good, man. They were living at large right now, dude. Business is booming. And as such, Louis Sr. expected all three of his sons to be as hard of a worker as he had been. And they ended up working their summers with their father at his construction company, digging ditches, moving bricks, driving trucks, doing a bunch of grunt work. Louis Sr. really wanted them to know the ins and outs of the business. And he really wanted them to know the value of hard work. I mean, after all, it was due to his hard work, his attention to detail, and his work ethic that now how his children were enjoying like a lifestyle and childhood that he did not enjoy at all. Now, it is said Tom was the most successful of the Capano siblings when it came to academics, and he could often be found reading. He was the bookworm. He was also the most obedient of his brothers, would always wash his dishes and do his chores without complaint, you know. So since the family was doing well, they got to go on trips. Their favorite destination was the beach, specifically the beach in New Jersey. Lewis actually bought a vacation home in Wildwood and rented out the bottom stairs portion and then left the upstairs portion for the family so they could take, you know, summer trips over there. And then, when they were almost 40 years old, Marguerite and Lewis Sr. unexpectedly got pregnant. Now, since Marguerite had never had any easy pregnancies, even when she was younger, this one, she's nearing 40, was, you know, said to have been especially tough on her. She was relegated to bed rest for practically her whole pregnancy. And it is said all of the Capano sons, especially Tom, waited on her hand and foot and took care of the home as she was laid up. At this point in time, Marion had left the home to go to college. And baby Gerard was born healthy in 1963. Now, around the same time, I think it was like not long after Gerard was born, Lewis Sr., who had chain smoked a good chunk of his life, worked long, hard hours most of his life, like manual labor, right? Construction is very hard. Carpentry is very hard and manual. Suffered a heart attack. And he was then forced to be on bed rest for several weeks. Once again, the boys, especially Tom, stepped up and took care of the home and their father and their baby brother Gerard. And when Lewis Sr. was back to normal, I guess he just dove right back into his routine. And at some point, I know him and Emilio dissolved their construction business. It wasn't like anything, you know, hostile or anything. They were still friends and stuff. I think they were, you know, just kind of ready to end that particular chapter of their lives. And the two would remain lifelong friends. Now, since he had achieved so much success and wealth, Lewis Sr. was determined and adamant that all of his children attend college and get a college degree. So even though he was, you know, well off and had like built his success, like, you know, his was seriously like a rags to riches story, it is said Lewis Sr. was still intimidated by those with college degrees. Now remember, like his company was building for all of like the housing in the area, so he got to be in contact with some pretty influential and like wealthy people, right? And it is said it didn't matter that he was also successful and kind of seen as, you know, one of their peers almost, right? Because he was, you know, as wealthy as they were, as respected as they were. But yeah, he was very intimidated by those who held college degrees, so he was adamant that his sons would be college graduates. And he wanted to make sure his children were not only highly educated, but they were also hard workers. So Tom and his brothers attended Catholic schools, and from the 9th grade onward, Tom and Lewis Jr. attended Archmere Academy, which was a Catholic prep school, and it was located in Claymont, about 12 miles from Wilmington. Now, this school was very hoity-toity, all right? Very, very expensive, very, very private, and, you know, very wealthy people's children went there, all right? It was one of those kind of schools. Like I said, Tom was the most academic out of all his brothers, and he succeeded quite well here at Archmere, getting very good grades. He was student council president and was even a star on the Archmere football team. It is said that it was pretty clear that Tom was sort of like the favorite Capano brother and was described as quiet, conservative, hardworking, and disciplined, very much like his father. He was also the most dependable, and it is said Lewis Jr. really admired and looked up to his older brother. Now, like I said, the school was very hoity-toity, and Lewis Sr. had already, like, you know, rubbed elbows and done business with very influential, wealthy people of the area. So, of course, Tom and Lewis Jr., going to this hoity-toity school, of course, also interacted with other children of the elites of the area. Now, as Tom grew into his teen years, he was, you know, very popular and handsome, and seemed to be like the leader type, you know, like the take charge leader type. And it is said he never treated anyone poorly, despite having like the stellar reputation and being sort of like the star of the school and whatnot, and everyone's favorite golden child. He never treated anyone poorly. In fact, it is said that he was actually very kind and generous to people. Apparently, there was one guy in Tom's class who was a diabetic, and sometimes he would slip into a diabetic coma, and it was Tom who actually kept a syringe of insulin on on him just in case he, had to use it on his friend. And I believe he did have to use it once or twice on his friend. But yeah, in that situation, right, when people were like freaking out, it is said Tom was like the calm, cool, collected one who just, got out the syringe and did what needed to be done. He was that type. A classmate said, quote, "You could literally trust him with your life. He was always so more mature than we were." And on top of being, wealthy and good looking, Tom also had the sexy sports car to go with the persona. Lewis Sr. had bought Tom and all of his brothers, fancy sports cars to drive around. And as you can guess, coupled with his wealth and his good looks and his personality and that sexy black sports car, Tom really drew the ladies' attention. One woman who knew him back then, named Emily Hensel, said, quote, "He was so handsome then. He was just about anything a teenage girl could want. Good looking, popular, and a football star." And Tom was sort of assumed to be like the most unobtainable of all the high school guys, right? By all the fellow high school girls. And yeah, it was assumed that he would definitely be with since he was the guy all the girls wanted, of course, he would probably end up with someone who was like the girl all the guys wanted, right? Another classmate, a woman who knew him back then, said, quote, "I knew then that he was kind of, when you were around Tommy, you thought you were in the presence of a god. None of the rest of us could ever hope to actually date him." Another classmate, a woman, said, quote, "When Tommy talked to you, you had the feeling that you were the only person in the room. He focused entirely on you. No eyes darting around the room or over your shoulder." So yeah, Tom was definitely, he was the dude. He was the dude to be. Tom graduated Archmere in 1967 and then went on to attend Boston College. When his father ventured into building apartment complexes, this was in 1970, Lewis Jr. dove headfirst into the business with his father. And they, along with Joey, slowly turned a huge profit. And Lewis Capano and Sons Incorporated was born. Meanwhile, Tom focused on his studies at Boston. He wasn't really interested in construction or real estate or really like the business world in general. It just wasn't really his thing. He was definitely said to have been the, quote, scholar of the family. He was much more interested in academia. Now, while at Boston College, Tom met his future wife, Kay Ryan. She was a half Irish, half Italian nursing student, and she was from Connecticut and was also a twin. She was a year younger than Tom, and she thought he was quietly brilliant, very thoughtful and capable, and was just very attracted to him. It was said that she was also a good foil for Tom as well, who could be sometimes moody, which we will get into. Whereas, Kay was more steady, the natural caretaker. I mean, hello, she was a nurse, so of course she was a natural caretaker. Tom and Kay dated throughout all of their time in college, and when he graduated in 1972, he decided to pursue a law degree over at the law school at Boston College. And this was because Kay had another year of school to go, and he didn't want to leave her. This was the one. The two would end up married in Fairview, Connecticut on June 17th, 1972, so not long after he graduated college. It was also the same day as the Watergate burglary, interestingly enough. Talking is very hard. Now, after she graduated, Kay got a job as a public health nurse. And this job brought her to some of the more sketchy, more low-income areas of Boston. And this is what Kay did as Tom worked towards his law degree. And Lewis Sr. and Marguerite supported the couple. That must be nice. They also paid Tom's tuition, paid their bills. So Kay didn't have to work, but she wanted to work because she loved her job, right? She had done all this work to get her degree. She didn't care if she'd be a kept woman. She wanted to do her work. She really enjoyed nursing. Tom graduated from law school in 1974, and then Tom and Kay moved to Wilmington, Delaware, and they moved into one of the apartments that Capano and Sons had built. And it was located in Newark, Delaware, and the summer he graduated, Tom set to work studying for the bar exam. Kay immediately got another job, again as a public health nurse, although this time she was sent to the more seedier areas of Philadelphia, and Tom did not much like this. He didn't like her being sent to these sketchy areas, and he actually preferred her not to really work, and certainly not do like some public nursing job, because his mommy and daddy will take care of him, so he didn't understand why she needed to do it. Like I said, Kay, she enjoyed her work, man. She'd worked hard to get her degree. Why not use it? She even enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania in order to work towards her master's. Tom ended up passing the bar in Delaware, but he was still not officially a lawyer as far as Delaware was concerned. He still had to serve 6 months as like a law clerk, And after his apprenticeship with a law firm, his first job as a lawyer came with the public defender's office. And it is said Tom quite enjoyed his work here. He always said that he enjoyed working public service rather than in the private sector. He then moved from being a defense attorney to being a prosecutor, and for the next 2 years was a prosecuting attorney for the Delaware Attorney General's office. And he worked in Wilmington. Now, it is said Tom was very good at his job, well liked in the courthouse, and still possessed that charm and quality that made people just love Tom. Remember, he had that ability to like make you feel like you were the only one around, that he was really listening to you, right? And on top of that charisma and charm, man, yeah, he had everyone eating out of the palm of his hand. One court reporter said, quote, "He had a God-given knack for friendship. It seemed to come so easily to him to treat people kindly, and everyone really liked him." Yeah, just keep these quotes in mind as we get further into this case, y'all. It's amazing the mask, the persona that people can put on, man. So Tom also served on a lot of boards and committees and meetings and stuff, and had a lot of meetings and stuff. Good Lord. After 2 years of being a deputy attorney general, Tom took a job in the private sector because he said he needed more money. I don't know how he could need more money because he had family money, but whatever. That's what he said. He said, quote, "I really liked those jobs, the ones he held in the public sector. I liked being in the courthouse, but I knew I couldn't do it for a career." He was then recruited by the general law firm of Morris, James, Hitchens, and Williams. And here there was a lot of opportunity for advancement, and Tom would see his salary increase. This was a very good career building stepping stone, is working at this law firm. Tom would be at this law firm for 8 years, and in August of 1978, Tom and Kay bought their home. It was an 18,740 square feet, beautiful house in Wilmington, and the couple ended up making a close-knit group of friends that comprised mostly of lawyers and their wives. And Tom also kept some of the friends he made from his public sector work as well, like friends from the courthouse and stuff. So everything I've talked about Tom, right? He's just almost too good to be true, right? He's the golden child. He's just popular and handsome, and he does all this public service work, and he's on all these committees and boards and charitable things. Well, what's the other side of that, right? What's the other side of the coin here? Well, there was a not great side of Tom as well. So even though, he had qualities such as, making someone feel like they were the only person in the room, like he was really listening to them, he also had, some not great qualities. He could be a stodgy, stubborn, spoiled, childish little brat. I mean, big shock, right? And he was especially stubborn and childish when he didn't get his way. As we will get into, when Tom doesn't get his way, when he doesn't get to dictate terms of anything, whether it be relationships, social situations, work, whatever, Tommy gets upset, all right? He's a little childish brat. He's a spoiled little boy. So there was one time during spring break where Tom, Kay, and a bunch of their friends, fellow attorneys and stuff, so fellow professionals, they were all hanging out. It was dinner time. And so the group, unanimously, as a group, wanted to go to this more chilled, laid back atmosphere, hangout place where, college kids were going to be there. Like I said, it was spring break, and they just kind of wanted to go there and relax. But Tom wanted to go to this gourmet 5-star, black tie only restaurant. But, everyone else just wanted to sit back and relax, put on some jeans and a t-shirt and just hang back and relax. But, Tom wanted to get all dressed up and get all fancy and have this 5-star meal. Like I said, the group had kind of unanimously come to the decision to go to the more mellow place. And when the group then asked Kay, well, what do you want? It is said Kay just sort of was quiet and then looked down at the floor. It was very clear to everyone who knew them, who set the terms in the relationship, who made the decisions. It is said though Kay was a very capable, smart, independent woman, her one weakness was Tom. He was her whole world. So since democracy rules, right, the group then went to the more laid back, mellow place, and they dressed casually, jeans and a t-shirt. But Tom, was still all being bitchy about being outvoted, and he still dressed in a suit. And then when they got there, he wouldn't get out of the car. And then when they finally did get him out of the car, he came inside and then just like stood at the end of the bar, just looking all sour and pouting. Yeah, being like a child. Yeah, this guy's supposed to be like a professional lawyer, guys. Spoiled little rich brat throws a little shit fit because he doesn't get to go to the restaurant that he wanted. Not to mention, how many 5-star gourmet meals do you think this guy's had already? Like, you can't just chill and relax with your friends. Yeah, it is said he just really brought everyone's mood down. And at Christmas time of 1979, after years of trying, Tom and Kay announced that they were pregnant. But unfortunately, only a couple of months later, on February 28th, 1980, Lewis Sr. suddenly dropped dead of a heart attack. He was working with Lewis Jr. on a project when he just keeled over and had a heart attack. He was only 57 years old. And it is said Tom just stepped in and pretty much like took care of his mother at this point, Marguerite. It is said she was just completely lost without her husband. She was completely dependent on him, had no idea how to manage. Even though they were rich beyond imagination, she just, remember dude, she grew up in a generation even older than the boomers. And, you know, that was her world, was her husband, you know, she just didn't know how to cope. Not to mention Gerard, or Jerry as they called him, was, you know, still at home. He was 17 when his father had died. She didn't know how to handle that. And it said Tom just swooped in and took care of everything. Paid her bills, managed her housekeeping, helped her with Jerry, and just really came to her aid. And it said all of the Capano brothers then sort of like bound together to help kind of raise their little brother. And in August of 1980, Kay gave birth to her and Tom's first child, a daughter they named Christy. And then, get this, and then on New Year's Eve of that same year, Tom made a move on the wife of one of his co-workers. The woman was 27-year-old Debbie McIntyre. She came from a rich, privileged money, you know, she came from money, like had family money, had, I guess, like a rough, traumatic, mentally abusive upbringing, had a very mentally ill mother, like extremely mentally ill. The book goes into a little bit more detail. She was married to David Williams. Yeah, the son of the Williams in the name of the law firm Tom worked at. They had a child, but it said Debbie was not happy in her marriage. She was also part of the same friend group that Tom and Kay hung out with. And she said at first she wasn't really attracted to Tom in that way. Like, she didn't find him like sexually desirable, but as, you know, he heaped more and more attention on her, the more enamored she became with him. So at the New Year's Eve party, it was being held at the Capano house. Tom and Kay were throwing it. So it was at this New Year's Eve party. Debbie was walking down the hall alone. I think she had to go to the restroom or something like that. So she was, you know, alone when Tom, out of nowhere, appeared, grabbed her, and pulled her into a bathroom. Quote, he leaned me up against the sink and said, I cannot control myself anymore. I am madly in love with you. Yeah, Debbie was stunned. Like, she was like, there's like no way you could be. And he just said, quote, of course I could. You are the most natural, the most loving, the most giving woman I've ever known. And, you know, Debbie laughed. Like, she wanted to believe everything Tom was telling her, because you see, Debbie like lacked a lot of affection and attention in her life throughout her childhood and in her marriage. So Debbie wanted attention. She was craving it, you know? So Tom telling her these things and giving her attention, you know, is certainly making her think, right? They parted ways that night with nothing physical happening other than a quick kiss. But then later in the week, Tom called Debbie and apologized. But he continued to call her, continued to heap attention onto her, continued to flatter her. She would later say, quote, he hooked me. I think he looked for a person like me. I think he was such a good reader of vulnerable women. Yeah, and he will get all into it. The truth of those words. So after this, Debbie and Tom engage in an emotional affair. All the while she's engaging in this emotional affair with Tom, she's kind of wrestling with some guilt because, you know, she knew Kay. Like I said, they ran in the same friend circle, so she did know Kay, but she didn't really know the state of Tom and Kay's marriage. Kay didn't really like talk about stuff like that. So all she knew was what Tom told her, right? And with Tom continuously love bombing her, continuously charming her, flattering her for months on end, and Debbie desperate for that attention and the affection, it's no surprise the two ultimately ended up sleeping together. And they first slept together in late May of 1981. And after this, they would engage in a physical affair. They would meet up at the cheap Motel 6 located off of Route 9 near the Delaware Memorial Bridge. In fact, it is said all of the Capano brothers were adulterers who were never loyal to their spouses or partners. So yeah, that's one thing that all the Capano brothers have in common, is they're all players. Now, all the while that Tom is engaged in this, affair with Debbie, he's still sexually active with Kay. Like, they don't have a dead bedroom. And she became pregnant with their second child around the time when he first engages in a physical affair with Debbie. Now, eventually, the guilt got to Debbie, and I guess she broke off the affair with Tom. Because, she was also Catholic, so that was eating at her, and she was really determined to make her marriage work. They had a kid. And she, too, ended up getting pregnant by her husband. And Debbie continued having an easy friendship with Kay. In fact, they bonded over their pregnancies. Yeah, can you believe that? Like, look, dude, I know Debbie's a victim in this, as we'll get into, but no, dude, that's trashy and skanky. Like, it is so trashy and skanky to sit there and be friends with the wife of the dude you're screwing. Like, come on, dude. In February of 1982, Kay gave birth to her and Tom's second child, another daughter they named Katie, and Debbie gave birth to a son. But, if your marriage is broken, a child is certainly not going to fix it, right? And it wasn't long before Tom and Debbie picked up their affair once again. And they picked it up towards the back end of 1983. Debbie and her husband divorced in October of that same year. And this was while she was, of course, engaged in the affair with Tom. And she knew at that point that Tom could never marry her, she knew she was going to be sort of like the woman in the shadows. Tom and Debbie would talk on the phone every day, sometimes several times a day, and they would meet up every Wednesday night to have sex. And it wasn't long before Debbie found herself growing emotionally dependent on Tom. And she grew a little surprised and upset when Tom announced him and Kay were having a third child, a daughter who they would name Jenny, and who would be born in November of 1983, so right as Debbie is divorcing her husband. Now, Debbie had not planned on having any more children in her life. She had the two with her husband, and for some reason, she assumed Tom was the same way. And she was also a little surprised to find out that he was still, intimate and sexually active with Kay. She assumed they had a dead bedroom. And she just didn't understand how, you could carry on a sex life, with your spouse while, engaging in an ongoing physical affair, that didn't really register with Debbie. She said, quote, "I felt if you were having sexual relations with someone, you were expressing your love for someone through intercourse, or rather intimacy." He didn't believe that. He told me that sex could be sometimes sport. So as he was having his affair with Debbie, Tom, who had now become a partner at the law firm, took a significant salary reduction in late 1984. And this was because he'd accepted the job as city solicitor for the whole city of Wilmington. Here, he ran the law department for Wilmington and supervised a dozen attorneys and an equal number of support staff. Right? There was a lot of responsibility with this position. Even if it didn't pay well, it was power that came with it, His office was responsible for defending the city, against legal claims, and was responsible for prosecutions in the Wilmington Municipal Courts. So he's got that going on in his career again as, he's continuing this affair with Debbie. And they, would maintain their affair for quite some time, guys, for many, many years. And after a couple of years of being together, Tom and Kay announced that they were pregnant with their fourth child. This was another daughter who they would name Alexandra, and she would be born in August of 1985. Now, if Jenny's birth had hurt Debbie, the birth of Alexandra was deeply painful. She had actually fooled herself into thinking that Tom and Kay's marriage was one not built on intimacy or sexual contact. But obviously, right, she was wrong. Yeah, she was dead wrong about that. Debbie would be so wrong about so many things in regard to Tom. Now, when she asked Tom about his upcoming fourth child and what's up with that, quote, "Tom told me he couldn't stop with an uneven number, so we had to have 4 children. He couldn't understand why I was upset." Even grosser was that Kay and Debbie had also maintained their friendship throughout this time, guys. They hung out, planned activities for their kids, the families hung out together, vacationing together even, and all the while, Tom and Debbie are screwing behind Kay's back. Now, Debbie said that she truly liked Kay, really did like her, but you know how it is with people, they can talk themselves into anything. And Debbie had pushed down her guilt, and pushed it down so much that she told herself her affair with Kay's husband, it wasn't even hurting Kay. Yeah, it wasn't even hurting her. Because after all, she got Tom's name, she got his children, she got to share his life publicly and openly, so it was okay. Dude, I swear, the things people can talk themselves into, it's amazing. The mental gymnastics people will put themselves to be able to live with themselves. In September of 1985, right after Alexandra had been born, Debbie ended up buying a large house that happened to, not be very far from Tom and Kay's. It was like a handful of blocks away. And because the house was very large and surrounded by large trees, it was very secluded and like hidden by like high, tall trees. And Tom was able to come over even more. Although it is said she never allowed him in the house when her children were there. It was still primarily Wednesday nights. But yeah, once in a while it'd be even more than that. Now, Tom only planned on being city solicitor for 2 years, and then he planned to return to the law firm in the private sector. He was intrigued with the political scene in Wilmington, and he'd always liked public sector work, right? We mentioned that earlier. But then, the then Wilmington mayor, Dan Frawley, who Tom had actually campaigned for in 1984, offered Tom a job as his chief of staff, which Tom gladly accepted. He was now in charge of every city department, y'all. Public works, zoning, fire, police. He said, quote, "Every morning, the chief of police had to call me and report on what incidents had occurred the night before." Tom had now considerable sway and power, although again, his salary would be less than what it would be if he returned to the law firm. But again, dude, it's the power and the prestige, right? Plus, what the hell does Tom need with like a decent salary, honestly, right? He's got mommy and daddy's money, so like, who cares? Tom promised to stay on for 2 years, and it said he became the like face of tact and control on Frawley's staff. I guess the mayor had a tendency to sort of shoot from the hip, as it were, and stick his foot in his mouth when he was like frazzled or cornered on something. And it said Tom just had the presence of patience and control and was able to like kind of put out any fires that the mayor may have started. And he was just very good at that. And as he had been in every other place thus far, Tom was very popular in his job here. Kay, meanwhile, was a nurse practitioner, and she was a nurse practitioner for a group of pediatricians. And it said Tom was not a fan of this. He didn't like how like cluttered and disorganized and like messy their home had gotten. Your rich, hire housekeepers. I mean, after all, his mother had stayed home and taken care of the children and tended to the family, and as Tom saw it, that's where Kay belonged. She was in college when you met her, dipshit. And as the years passed and, Tom's position grew and the Capano girls grew older, there seemed to just be more and more things that required Tom's attention. The girls were all natural athletes, and Tom would always make it a point to drop in on their games. He didn't stay for the whole thing or really that much, because he was always so busy, but he did make it a point to at least drop in. And let's not forget, not only does he have a very, important, prestigious position, like his job tugging at his time, he was a member of a bunch of boards and committees and stuff, and he still had his mistress that he was juggling. But it is said that the more stresses Tom had, the more responsibility he was expected to deal with, the more he juggled, the more adept Tom seemed to be at handling it all, including his mistress, Debbie. See, Tom saw himself as a rescuer of women. I know. He felt he always got along well with them, and he prided himself on being an ally to them. He felt he understood their vulnerabilities and their fears. I mean, after all, first his mother had needed him, and then his wife, and then his daughters, and now Debbie needed him too. He really thought he was like this considerate, just white knight and savior of women that just had the perfect shoulder to cry on. But like I said, right, Tom has another side to him, right? So even though he thinks of himself as this all-perfect guy who could be like this perfect rescuer of women and such, remember we said earlier, he could be moody. And he was so moody, Debbie learned to take extra care not to set off his mood. So we mentioned this earlier, Tom does not like not getting his way, right? And Debbie, being that quintessential trained submissive type of person, always accommodated him in order to avoid upsetting him. If she said something that he disagreed with, he would just sneer at her and say in a very nasty tone, quote, "That's a stupid statement. Why would you say something like that?" And whenever, this happened, she then made a mental note not to bring up that topic or say something like that again around him. Yeah, can you imagine having to take that much precaution and walk on that many eggshells? And it seemed like, this list of things that she kept track of not to bring up to Tom or whatever, was just growing and growing. Like, Tom and Debbie just did not really have a lot in common. She was old money. He was new. She was very active and outdoorsy. He was very sedentary, hated doing things outdoors. She would buy him gifts that, although inexpensive, were very thoughtful. He bought her pasta makers and gadgets for the kitchen, and he would tell her, well, she's so rich anyway. She had everything. What could he even really give her, you know? That was his excuse for buying these kinds of gifts for her. But it is said, in the bedroom is where they really had a lot in common. It said they had a tremendous sex life. And as with every aspect of her life, Debbie took extra care to really satisfy Tom in this regard. She went out of her way to please him and do what he wanted, and she was petrified that if she did not please him, he would just leave her. Like, she, at this point, guys, like, it's been years, she's firmly hooked. Like, she's completely emotionally dependent on Tom, and she wanted to make sure he didn't leave her. Tom had persuaded her to install, like, this massive, like, mirror that was opposite her bed. This was so, like, he could, like, you know, watch them have sex and stuff. She got a whole bunch of, like, sex toys and pornography, all in an effort to please Tom. But still, I mean, despite the flaws that Tom may have had, he was still loved by everyone, especially Debbie. Like, even though he didn't treat her the best, Debbie was completely under his spell. So in 1988, Tom worked hard on getting Mayor Frawley reelected, and it was assumed that he would continue on to be his chief of staff. However, Tom ended up resigning in early February of 1989, and the reason was even more surprising. He was leaving to actually go help the family out with the construction business Capano and Sons. His brother, Louis Jr., really needed Tom's help, and after continuous pleas from their mother, Tom had finally agreed. But he said he was only going to come in and help them for a year, and that was it. And turns out, once again, Tom had to come to the rescue. So Louis Jr. was very much a cliche of a spoiled rich trust fund kid, and a cliche of a corrupt businessman. So Louis Jr. had actually given money to a city council member, Councilman Ronald J. Aiello, and this attracted the attention of the feds. I know, shocked, right? The feds were interested in like political corruption? What? And so they were watching the councilman very closely, right? And in a perfect example of how the U.S. justice system works, especially if you're wealthy and well-connected, Tom used his charm, connections, and negotiation skills to barter with the Department of Justice on behalf of his brother. He managed to get Louis Jr. free from any charges and got his brother to agree to help set up the councilman. And that's exactly what happened. Now, it is said the 1 year that Tom served the family business was not a particularly, like, happy one for him. Apparently, even though Tom had, like, getting him out of trouble, Louis Jr. and Joey would just not really listen to Tom. And it was described as a, quote, tense time. And it said Tom was very relieved when in January of 1990, the promise to his mother and his family had been fulfilled. Now, after his duties to his family, Tom jumped immediately to a position that sort of surprised a lot of people. So then Governor Michael Castle had made Tom an offer for a position as his own chief counsel. Now, this was surprising because Michael was a Republican, Tom was a Democrat, but again, man, like, it was very prestigious. Now, it paid about half of what Tom could have made if he, you know, went back to the law firm in private practice, but he was actually very eager to get back into government work and public sector work. And, you know, he came for money. He would never hurt for it. And the position, like I said, was very prestigious. So yeah, Tom went ahead and took it. Can you imagine having the freedom to choose a job position that makes you happy and not have to worry about salary? Because, you know, your basic necessities are going to be paid for and taken care of. Wouldn't it be nice if we could all experience that? So as chief counsel to the governor, Tom would be called on to advise the governor on the constitutionality of pending legislation. And it is said, despite, like, you know, coming from a wealthy family and having this, like, prestigious job position, it is said Tom, unlike his brothers, outwardly and to the public, like, tried to downplay his wealth. He and Kay, you know, didn't have multiple beach houses and a bunch of fancy cars like his brothers had. Though, you know, don't get me wrong, like, his daughter still attended hoity-toity private schools and they never lacked for money. But it is said Tom, like, was just not, like, as outwardly flashy with his wealth as his brothers were, you know? In fact, it came off to everyone that Tom was like the responsible Capano brother, you know? He had come in and saved his brothers on multiple occasions. I mean, remember, that's why he had to come in and help save the family business, right? Another incident that highlights this happened at the end of 1991 when Joey Capano had driven through the house of his affair partner. By the way, she was a teenager when they had started their affair. I know. She was actually the family babysitter. Yeah, like I said, cliche, dude, cliche. So, she had grown up and broken things off with him, but Joey was obsessed, right? And he didn't take kindly to this. And he had driven through her house, kidnapped her, and sexually assaulted her before she managed to escape. And because of Tom's connection and his position, he got Joey out of some serious prison time, because that's how justice should work, right? He even talked Joey's ex-girlfriend from pressing the felony charges against his brother. In the end, Joey pled guilty to misdemeanor charges of assault, unlawful sexual contact, and criminal mischief. But it said this was just one of many things that Tom dealt with in 1991. Though his position was very prestigious, it was also very stressful, and apparently the stress manifested itself in a physical way. He developed ulcerative colitis, and his gut bled, and this caused, bleeding to come from his rectum, and it was just not very pleasant. Even though he had this, it is said that Tom really relished his role as chief legal counsel for the governor, and he also relished his role as the family savior, all right? He loved being the father of 4 perfect children, being the perfect husband, the perfect affair partner, and he also loved all these roles that enabled him to play the role of martyr. Basically, while he loved being everyone's savior and the one that everyone came to, he also loved to complain about it. And it's because this gave him an excuse to, treat his women and others around him like garbage. After all, he was allowed to snap, okay? Because everyone just expected too much of him, and he should have special allowances. Yeah, Tom thinks that he is special and that the rules do not apply to him. So Tom stayed with Governor Castle until 1992. During this time, he had even toyed with the idea of maybe running for political office himself. He thought he'd make a great attorney general for the state of Delaware, but he was told by advisors, friends, anyone who ran in political circles, bro, the scandals with your brothers alone would nuke any chance you had. Plus, it is said Tom just didn't have a great on-camera presence, you know what I mean? He wasn't the best at public speaking, and it said his strength just really lied in the behind-the-scenes stuff, So he decided not to pursue political office. Instead, he took a job at the law offices of Saul, Ewing, Remrick, and Saul, LLP, the board counsel for the state of Delaware and the city of Wilmington. So a pretty prestigious law firm. Tom would end up running their public finance department, doing detailed work, and this mainly involved setting the city and state bonds, mostly multi-million-dollar deals. It was very meticulous work, but apparently it paid substantially well. And it is said Tom was very good at it. He was back in the private sector and he was making really good money. And at this point in his life, his public work and his community work was very substantial. He was on the board of trustees at St. Mark's High School, on a bunch of different academies, including Archmere. He was a board member of the National Conference of Christians and Jews, chairman of the Wilmington Parking Authority, in charge of both the bench and bar committees and the Delaware Supreme Court's long-range planning committee. All the while, he was still working with the family church, St. Anthony's, as well. So yeah, he had so much on his plate. Apparently, Catholic education was very important to Tom, and because he did so much for the local community and for his church, Tom used his religion to excuse his hypocrisy. In his mind, because remember, he's still maintaining his affair with Debbie, in his mind, this affair was justified, all right? It wasn't adultery, and he wasn't being a bad Catholic by having an affair. He gave so much to everyone all the time, And he felt this afforded him a little bit of leeway, He was allowed to break the rules a little bit. Thus, for him, committing adultery was not sinful. Yeah. So in 1993, Tom was a partner at the law offices of Saul and Ewing, and it is when he's a partner at this law firm in 1993 that he would become involved in yet another affair. This one with a 28-year-old named Marie Fahey, and she was the appointment secretary for the new governor, then Governor Tom Carper. She was responsible for getting the governor to all of his appointments, setting his schedule and stuff, getting him to these events on time and scheduling out all the details, who was going to be there, what he was going to wear, who was going to be on his security detail, stuff like that. She was actually so efficient and dependable at her job. She had actually worked for Tom Carper since he had been a congressman. So we're now going to get a little bit into Anne. Who's Anne? Who is this new mistress that Tom has found for himself? So we're gonna dive into her. So Annie's parents were Robert and Kathleen Fahey, and both of them were Irish immigrants. Robert was a salesman for IBM, while Kathleen worked as a secretary at the DuPont plant. The couple met when Robert had made a sales call there, and he had asked a friend who worked there, like, to introduce them. Like, saw Kathleen, was like, oh, hey, like, can you introduce us? And the rest was history. The couple married in 1953 and ended up having 6 children. There was the oldest, Kevin, who was born in 1954. Then there was Mark, who was born in 1956. Then Robert Jr., who came along in 1958. Kathleen Jr., the second? We don't really do that with female names, huh? But Kathleen, named for her mother, came along in 1960. Brian came along in 1961. And then the baby, Annie Marie Sinead Fahey, came along on January 27th, 1966. Now, after the children were born, Robert switched to selling insurance, and Kathleen became a stay-at-home mom. Now, the Faheys were not exactly the most well-off. They were almost the opposite of the Capanos. Robert Jr. would later recall, quote, most of us kids were 2 years apart. Our house wasn't that big, and it seemed like there was never enough money. Now, the Faheys were adamant about keeping their Irish roots and their Irish culture intact. And to that end, they participated in several organizations and events in the Wellington area that strove to achieve that. This included them participating in a program where Irish school teachers would come to the US, and it was during the summertime. And it said, despite, the financial difficulties the Faheys had, they happily opened their doors to these school teachers. They would need host families for the summer. And it is said the Faheys always opened their door. Now, the family, even though, they weren't the richest, they seemed like an average, happy, upbeat family. They faithfully attended St. Mary Magdalene Church. And Kathleen was a very loving, very active mother. She always planned picnics and outing and all kinds of events for her children. However, unfortunately, slowly, Robert Sr. was falling into alcoholism, but it started off very slowly at first, right? As it usually does. Now, Annie's nickname was Anal Annie, and this was because of her compulsive tidiness and neatness. She would arrange her CDs, records when she was younger, in alphabetical order. She would stack all of her pennies so Lincoln's profile was facing the same direction. Always habitually made her bed literally as she was getting out of it every morning. She folded her dirty laundry before she put it in the hamper. She was compulsively tidy and neat. It is said Annie enjoyed an especially close relationship with her mother. They were both very much alike, both very pretty, looked pretty similar. They had a wonderful sense of humor. And it said they both had very loud, contagious laughs that you could hear from a block away. Kathleen was especially protective of Annie, probably because she was the baby, and would always make Brian and her sister, Kathleen, hold Annie's hand as they walked to school. Kathleen would even let out the family dog, Butch, so he could wait on the corner as the kids walked home from school, and he'd be on the corner to meet them. It was definitely a very tight family unit, and it was said Kathleen was at its center. Unfortunately, in 1974, when Annie was only 8 years old, her mother was diagnosed with lung cancer. I know, cancer is the worst. Now, the only child to have left home at this point in time was Kevin, and it said Annie was too young to really understand what was going on with her mom, All she knew was that her mom would go to the hospital, but every time she would come back looking paler and thinner. Family and friends of the community stepped in to help the family out as Kathleen was, battling cancer, as she was, too sick to really cook or clean. And then when she came back from a 2-week hospital stay, Kathleen came home and lay in bed looking very, very pale, very, very sick, but, keeping a smile on her face as her children visited her around her bedside. And Annie was too young, and her siblings had tried to protect her from it to really understand and process that her mother had come home to die. She was dying on her deathbed with her family surrounding her. But unknown to anyone, all right? Annie, who on the outside was happy, laughing, and very carefree, did know something was wrong, all right? She knew. Kids pick up on way more than you think, man, I'm telling you. And I don't know why people forget this. Hello, we were all kids. You remember picking up on stuff stuff that people were assumed because you were a kid, you didn't pick up on it. So maybe she didn't know exactly what was wrong with her mother, like her mother had lung cancer or what exactly that meant, but she knew there was something wrong with her mom. She asked one of her friends if like her mom was gonna die. And they comforted each other by reasoning like, no, that didn't happen. Like moms didn't leave their children. Parents didn't leave their children. But unfortunately, on March 16th, 1975, Kathleen finally passed away. Kathleen II, who was only 14, said, quote, "The day that my mother died, our universe fell out from under us." Now, the older siblings didn't think Annie had really registered that their mom was no longer with them because, you know, she was so young and they had really tried to like block her from the worst of it. And the day after her mom's death, like Annie was out in the front yard playing with her friends. But, you know, as we know, on the inside, she knew something was wrong. As we will get into, Annie does not really let her emotions show. No one really knows what's going on with Annie. She tries to hide it. It is said when she went back to school, you know, after her mom died, she was absolutely mortified when the teacher announced to the class that Annie had lost her mom and so that everyone should be nice to her. Like, I don't know, doesn't that seem completely inappropriate? That seems totally inappropriate to me. And Annie hated this. She didn't want anyone asking her questions. She didn't want anyone like treating her any differently. And yeah, she hated when the teacher did that. A childhood friend and a friend that would remain close to her for, you know, her whole life, Beth Barnes, said, quote, "I remember how scared she was that we would look at her weird." And after Kathleen's death, the Fahey family really struggled hard. The kids, because remember, they already weren't exactly the richest, and with Kathleen gone, it was just really bad. The kids often went hungry, were often left to fend for themselves. Robert Sr. just completely devolved into alcoholism. He worked less and less, became bitter, angry that life had been unfair to him. He just could not cope with life without his wife, you know. We always talk about, you know, a lot of these women, right, how their lives revolve around their husbands and stuff, and they don't know what to do when they're gone, but no one really talks about like the men that are sort of the same way. Like he had relied on his wife for the child rearing, the house duties, and you know what I mean, like keeping the family together, and now that fell on him and he just was not up to the task. Annie's siblings did do their best to sort of shield their sister from the worst of it, and they took on a more parental role in her upbringing. Kathleen's mother, so the children's grandmother, Catherine, she did her best to help the family, but she lived in Pennsylvania and she struggled to keep food on her own table. But she would come over once a week to help cook and clean, but she wasn't like the cuddly type of grandmother. Catherine had grown up in a very hard knock, hard scrabble life. She had immigrated from Ireland, and so she taught her grandchildren, you know, independence, survival, and a strong work ethic. And Catherine would end up being a very influential, important figure in Annie's life. The local Irish community in Wilmington also stepped in to help the family, but of course, like, you know, nothing could replace what Kathleen had done with her family, right? Like, that was her family. And despite the chaos of her home life, you know, Annie did try to, you know, be like the other kids. She took Irish dancing lessons. And another Irish family with 7 children of their own, the Mulherns, became a refuge for young Annie. They gladly accepted her into their home. She would often go over there for 5 or 6 days in a row, and then she'd come home for a couple days, and then she'd be back off to the Mulherns. And in the summer, that's where you would find her constantly. Now, as the years passed, Robert Sr. completely gave up, just completely gave up. He lived in a bottle, didn't work, and the only income being provided for the family right now was from like insurance payments and like pensions that he had bought like in better times, and like I think he got some sort of like commissions off like insurance policies he had sold or something. So that was like the only income coming in. But eventually this money dried up, but Robert Sr. just continued to drink. And like with most alcoholics, he would turn violent when he drank. And the children learned to stay far away from him when he was in these moods. He would use Annie as a verbal punching bag and emotionally and verbally abused her. He would say that she was fat, she was ugly, no one would want a fat, ugly wife like her. He would even go so far as to calling her like a slut or a whore. And Annie, every time he would get in these moods and start going off, she would just try to hide from his insults. You know, she'd go into the closet or she'd hide under a table, and she would just try to like shrink down as small as possible. Like, you know how it is when you're scared, right? Like you just are trying to like disappear and be as small as possible. And that's what Annie would do. She would say Hail Marys in her head, but of course, her dad would always find her and then just always berate her and verbally abused her. And of course, as with most abuse, this would end up having a profound impact on Annie. And she actually ended up developing many things due to this abuse, including claustrophobia. She ended up developing a fear of dark and enclosed spaces. Now, without asking, I guess friends and neighbors of the community stepped in and paid the Faheys' bills and stuff. Remember, like, they were part of, like, the local Irish community. And when Kathleen had passed, you know, they did their best to kind of step in. Annie's siblings all got jobs, except for Annie, of course. She was too young. She was the baby. And eventually, one by one, the Fahey siblings were able to go off to college with grants and scholarships and them working and saving. They did manage one by one to go off to college. And then, before you knew it, it was just Brian and Annie left at home. Now, all through her tumultuous childhood and upbringing, Annie never wanted anyone to feel sorry for her. And she always would hide her insecurities behind laughter and mischievousness, you know? Like, that's why she always had a sense of humor, was always joking and laughing and put on that front, you know? She didn't want anyone to know what was really going on because she never wanted anyone's pity. She never spoke about her mother or her home life, was very bright, got good grades, and really, she tried to keep up her hopes for the future. Like, she tried just telling herself, like, you know what? This is temporary. This is just my childhood. Like, I'm gonna grow up and I'm gonna go make my dreams come true, you know? One day I'll be an adult and I'll have my own house and stuff, you know? So this is what really got her through. And her siblings, of course. Annie had a lot of friends, and so she had, you know, lots of places to go to and hang out. And with her father spending what little money the family had on alcohol, the home was often without electricity, without water, without phone. And it was pretty bad. Like, Annie had to shower at the school, and she studied at friends' homes. And she never wanted anyone to know just how desperate her situation had been. When Annie was in the 7th grade, somehow her father managed to marry again. And this was in 1980. He married a woman named Sylvia Bachmersky, who had 2 children of her own. Now, Annie was super stoked at this. She was so excited to have a mother figure back in her life. Unfortunately, the marriage would only last a couple months. Robert Sr. had straight up lied to Sylvia and deceived her. She had no idea he was unemployed, no idea he wasn't even looking for work, and no idea that he was a raging alcoholic. And though Sylvia, you know, she did care for Brian and Annie, remember, she had 2 kids of her own, and she eventually, like, she told them one day, like, I'm sorry guys, I gotta go. Like, you can always call me whenever you need anything, but like, I gotta leave. And the Fahey house had reverted back to the way it was once before. But thankfully, as Annie got older and like started entering junior high and high school, she started not putting up with her father's like verbally abusive crap and just his behavior in general. She would defend herself with a hockey stick and would like chase him around the house and smack him when he like tried to steal from her or when he'd start berating her. So good for her. She grew a little bit of a backbone, you know? Now, Annie attended Brandywine High School. And here, like I said, you know, she was always pretty bright academically, so she, you know, got pretty good grades, played field hockey and basketball, and, you know, somehow managed to survive her horrible, chaotic home life. At this point, she was the only one left at home. Brian was a freshman at college, and it is said the Fahey siblings, though physically apart, were extremely close emotionally. They all kept pretty close tabs on one another, and things were looking up. But unfortunately, when Annie was only 15, Robert Sr., who of course had long stopped paying the bills, including the mortgage, lost the house. And now Annie was homeless. The house sold for less than its value, and it said the Faheys lost all of their physical possessions. The only thing they got to keep were some sentimental things like photos. They lost everything. A girlfriend of Annie's, whose cousin Annie frequently babysat for, Carol Crichton, happily offered Annie a place in her home. That way Annie wouldn't have to move and she could stay and continue going to Brandywine High School. And though Carol and her family thought of Annie as like one of the family and happily, you know, put her up, Annie felt like she never belonged. She felt guilty for eating their food, using their resources, and just constantly felt like a burden. So she went out of her way to make sure that Carol never had to clean up after her at all. She would always clean up after herself, and she would always undereat. She would always leave the table like still starving for food because she didn't want to waste their food. She didn't want them wasting their hard-earned money and food on her. And so Annie would often undereat, and this right here, this problem right here of Annie under eating would be a lifelong problem for her. And we'll get into it later. So Brian, even though he was attending college, would often drive from Newark to give Annie a ride home from school and take her out to dinner. But even here, even with her brother buying her dinner, Annie, still under 8, she still felt like a burden. She hated relying on anyone. She carried an immense sense of like guilt and shame for having to rely on other people, having them have to spend their money on her. And she hated this. She always tried to make herself small, take up the least amount of space, and just tried her best never to be a burden on anyone. And along with her under eating, this sense of like guilt and shame about herself, the self-loathing, her compulsive neatness would end up being lifelong problems for Annie that she worked really hard to deal with. Now, unfortunately, in Annie's junior year of high school, Carol had to tell her like, hey, we love having you here, but we can't afford to have you here anymore. I'm so sorry. And so Annie was forced to go live with Brian and her father, who had a small apartment in Newark at this point. And she begged her brother and father to like, somehow like, can we please find a way so I can graduate from Brandywine? I've got my senior year, all my friends are here, like this is where I want to graduate, like can we please make it work? And somehow they found a way for her to do just that. She found a waitressing job at the charcoal pit, and through her tips and paycheck managed to graduate from Brandywine and pay her way as much as possible. But then, during her senior year of high school, her brothers Kevin and Robert Jr. said Annie could come live with them in the home that they had bought, which happened to be near Brandywine High School. Better yet, Annie would even get her own bedroom at their place. So she was super stoked. Super stoked. And in 1984, Annie graduated high school. And through financial aid and loans and saving from her job, she was able to attend Wesley College located in Dover. And here she majored in international relations. She had also gotten in on an athletic scholarship, specifically for hockey. And yeah, through loans, financial aid, and working, she managed to scrape through college and get the money. She quickly found part-time work while going to school, sometimes working 2 or 3 jobs. And it was, all the typical grunt jobs you can think of: retail, waitressing. She even worked at a dental office. And I said Annie had the best time in college, lived in the dorms. She, finally was normal. She felt like every other college kid at that point. And while at college, she was very sociable, very popular, outgoing. And so she had lots and lots of friends. And she was always smiling, man. Even when she was depressed or anxious or had self-loathing or self-doubt, which she constantly struggled with, Annie was she was the fun one, She was outwardly cheery and stuff like that. She worked very hard to hide that part of herself that was depressed and anxious and hated herself. She had really perfected the art of hiding her pain. It is said only those who knew Annie extremely well, like her closest friends, could tell when she was going through these times. Annie finished her 2-year degree at Wesley, and then on March 24th, 1986, Robert Sr. died of a heart attack at the age of 64. His alcohol had aged him well before his time. His heart had been in terrible shape, and he also suffered from leukemia. And this would be the start of a pretty bad period for Annie. All the memories that she had worked very hard to repress and push down and like barricade away just came bubbling to the surface with her father's death. And she struggled. In October of 1986, she attended the University of Delaware, located in Newark. And this was a vastly larger school than Wesley had been. And here, the very large school, coupled with her recent trauma and her pushed down thoughts and feelings about her childhood, all combined to overwhelm Annie. And for once in her life, she was unable to maintain that outward happy facade. She only attended the school for 1 semester, fell into a deep depression, missed a lot of classes, and finally just fully withdrew from the school. She moved in with her brother Brian, sought out professional therapy to help with her depression, which would grip her for 6 months. Now, when she managed to crawl her way out of that depression, out of that hole, she realized that what she really missed was like that close, tight-knit community feeling of Wesley and that small community in Dover. She missed that. And she decided to move in with some friends there. At this point, Wesley had actually become a 4-year school. And so when she moved back, she enrolled and found a job as a waitress. And she did certainly have to scrap and struggle and work very hard to pay her way through school. And, because she was paying her own way and working these minimum wage jobs, it did take take her longer than an average student to get her degree, but Annie did it. She ended up getting her degree. And it said Annie just had a gift for making friends. I told you before how she was like very sociable and funny and friendly. And yeah, this attracted a bunch of people, so she had a lot of friends. Not only did she have active friendships with girls from childhood and high school, she continued making even more at college and later in her adult life. Some of her closest group of friends included Beth Barnes, Jackie Binnersley, Kim Hortzman, and Jenny Columbus, whose brother, Paul, Annie ended up dating. In fact, Paul was the first serious boyfriend and the first real relationship Annie ever had, and they would end up dating for 3 years. They ended up breaking up in the summer of 1991, but they remained friends, and Annie remained close with the Columbus family. After all, Jenny was a close friend, and, Jenny's parents considered Annie like a second daughter. Now, during her second run at Wesley, when she was going for her 4-year degree, a professor knew Annie had a knack for languages, all right? She was very fluent in Spanish. Like, Annie loved speaking Spanish. She especially loved tripping people out when this like pale white Irish chick just started like speaking fluent Spanish and stuff. She loved messing with people like that. But she had a gift for language and loved language, and she loved Spanish. And this professor knew that and ended up facilitating an abroad internship for Annie in Spain, even finding her a host family to stay with. Now, when Annie told her brother Brian about, all this, he did warn her like, that sounds great, but keep an eye on this professor. This seems kind of sketch. This kind of seems like he may want more than just a teacher-student relationship, so just keep your eye out. And Annie said just, kind of grinned and chided her brother and was like, please, like, you think I don't realize, like, when someone's hitting on me, like, I've been waitressing for how long? Believe me, dude, like, I'm good, don't worry. She said she had a better sense than being with, like, some older married man, and just kind of gave her brother a little bit of a hard time. Now, it turns out Brian was absolutely right. The professor was trying to hit on Annie, and I guess when the professor broached the subject with Annie, she, gently but firmly was like, nah, Bri, I ain't too into that. But it is said the professor took the rejection quite well and still helped Annie with her abroad internship. It is said Annie had a magical time in Spain. She loved Spain, always wanted to go back. And she ended up getting her degree in political science from Wesley on May 9th, 1992. Now, while trying to get a job with her degree, she waitressed at TGI Fridays in Wilmington and applied for an internship with the OAS in Washington, D.C. The OAS is the Organization of American States. A friend actually encouraged her to apply, and she was accepted for a 4-month internship. She ended up using her fluency in Spanish to like translate a bunch of documents and stuff. And while in D.C., she found a place to stay with other girls her age, worked at AOS during the week, and then took the 2-hour commute back on Fridays to work as a waitress in Wilmington over the weekend. Now, even though this new chapter of Annie's life was very intimidating to her, she had a lot of anxiety. No one ever knew it. Like I said, man, she had successfully built up that facade, that wall again. Like, she was back to being that happy, funny, carefree person that she had been. Now, when the OAS job ended, Annie at this point, she'd made some connections of her own and applied through these connections, ended up applying for a job opening in Delaware Congressman Tom Carper's office. She was hired on as a receptionist. Now, apparently she was a perfect fit for a congressman's staff. She was very detailed, thorough, competent, hardworking. On top of, being beautiful and friendly and outgoing, she was perfect. Now, it is said Carper was very impressed with Annie's skills. And Annie thought, even though Carper enjoyed like her skills and, valued her, she thought her work with him would be short-lived. When after working for him about 3 or 4 months, Carper announced that he was gonna go back to Delaware and run for governor. Thus, he'd be leaving DC and heading to Wilmington. But it turns out Annie was hired to work for his campaign, and she went. At this point in time, it was the fall of 1992, and Annie was 26 years old. And she did so much for Carper's campaign, like door to door, handing out pamphlets, licking and stamping envelopes, stuffing envelopes. Like, she did all of the down and dirty grunt work for his campaign and worked very hard. It is said she was not afraid to, get her hands dirty and pay her dues. And she was hoping that if Carper won, that he would keep her on as part of his staff. Now, Jackie Binnersley, she was one of Annie's close friends, ended up buying a home in Wilmington and had a roommate. And Jackie invited Annie to come live with them when she came back to Wilmington and was campaigning for Carper. Jackie was like, hey, why don't you come stay with me and my roommate? And Annie did right before Christmas time. And of course, Annie got along famously with the roommate, of course. It was a very good time. Jackie said Annie, quote, was not shy and, quote, was a funny person. Very particular, very neat, very organized. So when Annie moved in, Jackie noticed his behavior because she was like, Annie wasn't really like this in high school. Like, she'd always been neat and tidy. You know, I explained some of her compulsive habits that she would do, but she wasn't this bad. Jackie said, quote, I was a bit surprised. Just some funny things she did. I'm sure we've all stayed at hotels. They pull a bed down and they put a mint on your pillow. She would do that and powder her sheets. When she got up in the morning, the first thing she would do was make her bed. She dusted her baseboards. Now, some think Annie really ramped up her compulsive, clean, neat behavior when her grandmother, Catherine, had died. And she had died just before Annie moved in with Jackie and her roommate. And this was in the beginning of November of 1992. That's when her grandmother had passed. I said this earlier, right? Catherine was a very important figure to Annie's life. She taught Annie how to clean and was just a very stable, influential figure. Annie took her grandmother's death especially hard and marked it in her diary. That is another thing that you will see in this case, and it's part of the reason why there's so much to get into. We have actual excerpts of Annie's diary. And how often do we get to see the inside of a victim's mind? What's going on? What are they feeling, you know? And it's just so interesting. And we'll be reading a lot of diary entries from Annie. So she marked the death of her grandmother in her diary, and it read, quote, Nan died on November 2nd, 1992. The most tragic part of my life. I always believed Nan's life would be eternal. She was the most reliable, stable, sober adult person in my life. Part of me died with Katie. I still feel numb. The world is a less fortunate place, but heaven is dancing with her arrival. Turned out Carper did end up winning the governorship, and he was inaugurated in January of 1993. And as it turns out, Annie was hired on as part of his staff. And as we know, she was hired on as his scheduling secretary. He set up in the governor's offices in Wilmington in the Carville State Building. But even though Annie had certainly come a long way from her traumatic childhood, she'd achieved much, she still struggled with her self-image, right? We mentioned a little bit about this before. You know, she of course still had trauma resulting from her father's abuse. I mean, she had never really dealt with it. And because of his abuse, she saw herself as fat, even though she wasn't by a long shot. She made conscious efforts to control her eating. And as we have already noted, her compulsiveness for neatness and tidiness and organization really ramped up after her grandmother's death. But fortunately, you know, because she had a pretty good job now, she could actually afford some therapy. And she started seeing a therapist, Bob Connor. And he really helped her and gently encouraged her to eat more. It said Annie really felt helped by him, even sharing a laugh with him on more than one occasion. You know, we've already kind of mentioned Annie doesn't let a whole lot of people in, you know, really who she really is on the inside. But as said, you know, through time, Bob Connor became one of those people that she could trust, you know, and it was, you know, through this building of trust that she felt she could actually make progress with him. So Annie made even more close friends as she worked in the governor's offices. His staff was only about 25, so, you know, they all kind of grew pretty close to each other. Some of Annie's closest friends that she would meet here included Jill Morrison, who worked in constituent services. And here she would direct people to the proper agencies. And so, yeah, they worked in the same building, and Jill and Annie grew quite close. They started around the same time, often went to lunch together, went shopping together, working out, and because of their positions, also attended a lot of functions together. Now, Jill was with 27-year-old Annie on the night that she met 43-year-old Tom Capano. So it was on April 26th, 1993. And it was at some fundraiser event at some socialite's house. Kay had actually been the one to buy the ticket, but she couldn't go, so she had sent Tom in her place. And later that night, towards the end of the evening, Annie recognized Tom and went up and introduced herself, saying that he may know her sister Kathleen. And Annie, Tom, and Jill ended up having a pleasant conversation. And it's through this conversation that Annie and Tom realized that they actually knew quite a lot of the same people. And so they talked about that. Now, Tom's work occasionally brought him to the Carville State Building, and after this night, he would make a point to stop by this building quite often and stop by Annie's desk and, chat with her and visit with her a little bit. Now, Jill noticed this, but she didn't think too much of it at first. Not even when Annie started having lunch with Tom. And she had lunch with him all throughout the spring and summer of 1993. And again, Jill didn't really raise too much of an eyebrow at first because, Annie was very friendly. She was very outgoing, had a lot of friends, and was sociable. And she explained to Jill that they were just friends. Jill said, quote, Anne-Marie was just a very friendly person. And she explained that she was friends with him and said they would have good conversations. And he relied on her for advice. That's the way she was, so I found nothing odd at that point. But in autumn of that year, one day, Annie casually mentioned to Jill that she was going to dinner with Tom. She had wanted to borrow Jill's jacket. And this is when Jill starts kind of like raising an eyebrow. Dinner just seemed a lot more intimate than lunch, you know what I mean? It just seemed different. The next day, Jill asked Annie how dinner had gone. Quote, she told me about the restaurant and that it was a nice evening, that Mr. Capano had ordered the food for her. I asked her, did he kiss you? And she said yes. Jill didn't press any further than that, though. One thing that Jill knew and people close to Annie knew was that she was a very, very reserved person. And she didn't like to show parts of herself or her life that she didn't want to show. And Jill knew this. In fact, Annie was always quoted as saying, quote, the more you push me in one direction, the more I go in the other direction. So Jill knew not to press her too much. She didn't want to pry. She figured, you know what, if Annie wants to open up to me, she will. But yeah, Jill did not much like the idea, of Annie being with this much older guy who was married, she thought her friend deserved more than that. And so she wasn't a big fan of it, but she wasn't going to pry. Remember, it's not like Annie and Tom were exclusive at this point. Jill knew that Annie did go out and see other men her own age, and did date. But Jill also knew that, Annie did have that desire to be in love, to get married and have children someday. But Annie's issues stemming from her childhood would definitely play a little bit of a barrier for her in the love department. So Annie could be very dramatic. She greatly feared rejection, and due to her self-esteem and her body dysmorphia issues, she would go to worst case scenario over every little thing. If a guy said he would call and he didn't, he didn't call at the time that he said he would, she was convinced that he would never call again, that she must have done something to upset him. She must have done something to drive him away. Why didn't anyone want to love her? She was very insecure in relationships. But she was so good at putting on that happy front that it was said only those who were extremely close to Annie knew that she suffered from these insecurities in her relationships. She did not let it show. One night in the fall of 1993, Jackie was surprised when she got home and found Annie sitting very intimately on the couch with Tom. And she certainly knew who Tom was. Tom was very well known and well established at this point in the greater Wilmington area. Jackie recognized him, knew who he was, knew he was married with children, and she was shocked to have this prominent local figure in her living room on her couch. And she was even more shocked that Annie would have anything to do with him. Quote, she wasn't promiscuous at all. She was very reserved, conservative, never had guys over to the house. But that night, she had her cleavage showing. Annie usually wore blouses and pantsuits and stuff that was very conservative. She had body dysmorphia issues. So of course, she wasn't comfortable really showing off her body. So, seeing Annie, not just with this famous local figure, but on the couch and dressed like that, really kind of threw Jackie for a loop. She's like, whoa. And though, they weren't making out when she walked in, Jackie kind of took the whole scene in and knew that she had interrupted something. They were sitting extremely close on the couch facing each other. There was wine. Annie's cheeks were flush, Quote, I detected something. I just felt uneasy. Body language tells you a lot. You could just tell by the way they were sitting that there was some contact there. We know that situation, right? Where people think they're being all slick. You can tell, right? And Jackie could tell that she had interrupted something. Later, Jackie straight up asked Annie, about Tom, what she was doing with him. And Annie really thought Jackie was going to buy the oh no, we were just friends excuse. But yeah, Jackie didn't buy it. Tom would end up becoming a regular visitor to the apartment. And neither Jackie nor Annie's other roommate much cared for him. They just kind of saw through his BS, and they determined he was a phony. Quote, I usually give people a chance, but I just got a bad impression. He just went over a little bit too much. I thought it was false, the way he kind of gave me compliments on the house. Like with Jill, Jackie, and Annie's other roommate thought that Annie deserved way better than like an older married man. Especially an older married guy who would always come over and bear gifts and sweet words, but, never took Annie out. They also got this weird sense that like Tom really wanted them to like him and like jump for joy when he came around. It was very weird. Just very off-putting and cringe to them, They're just like, why is this like older guy? Like, why does he want us to like him? It's really weird. Now, for several weeks, his visits suddenly stopped, and like Jackie and Annie's other roommate were like, oh my God, did she finally get rid of him? And they were super stoked. But by Christmas time, he was back. So another friend Annie made in the governor's office was Siobhan Sullivan. She was a former basketball star and a young state trooper with the Delaware State Police. And she helped provide security for the governor. Annie had introduced Siobhan to Tom at some event. It was some social function at the governor's mansion. And even Siobhan couldn't help but notice just how close Annie and Tom were. Now, Annie often got tickets to social functions just with her job, but Tom was able to get tickets to like the creme de la creme social functions, right? And Siobhan would always tease Annie about like, oh, where'd you get these tickets? And, she knew it was from Tom, obviously. Now, since Tom was such a familiar person and familiar like figure in like the Delaware political circles and whatnot, no one, including Siobhan, really noticed how often he happened to drop by the governor's office at the Carville State Building, specifically the 12th floor where Annie worked. But, due to the nature of her job, it wasn't too long before Siobhan couldn't help but notice Tom's constant presence. Like, it caught her attention before, like, really anyone else. Now, on more than one occasion, she did ask Annie about Tom's frequent visits, but Annie just, told her they were just friends. Quote, she always said he was one of her best friends and that they talked occasionally. So even though Annie is engaging in this affair and is super busy with her job working for the governor, she still remained very close to her siblings. They were a very tight-knit group, especially considering the trauma they survived, and they were determined to give the next generation, their own children, the upbringing they didn't have. And other than one of her brothers, Mark, struggling with alcoholism, apparently the family seemed to be well on their way to this goal. It is said Annie visited her nephew Brian, was Mark's son, very often. She wanted him to feel like he was part of a bigger family. Mark and his wife were divorcing, and she also never missed a beat on the job. And it is said Governor Carper, he really liked Annie a lot, like really appreciated her work and her personality. And, he was like, you know what? She deserves a nice young man. And so, I'm going to keep an eye out. And next time I come across someone who's worthy of her, I'm going to see if I can play matchmaker. And this was, of course, without him knowing about the ongoing affair Annie had with Tom. And man, Tom was able to worm his way into Annie's life so methodically and meticulously and easily. And this was, due to Annie's vulnerabilities coupled with Tom's charm and manipulation. So Tom wanted to know every detail of Annie's life. He wanted her to confide in him. Like, remember, Tom has that ability to make you feel like you're the only person in the room. Well, yeah, he made Annie feel like she was the only person in the world. So, though Annie was engaging in this affair, I guess she was really struggling with, like, the morality of it, right? The ethics of it. And the pressure of keeping this deep, dark secret from her family and, like, some of her other close friends was starting to get to her, This was all starting to mount some pressure on her. So one of the reasons Annie was struggling with morality of it was her Catholicism. She was Catholic, devoutly Catholic, and her religion meant a lot to her. But, despite the religion, despite the morality of it and like the pressure, she ended up falling for Tom. She actually marked the day in her diary. It was the night of her 28th birthday. Quote, I have fallen in love with a very special person whose name I choose to leave anonymous. We know who each other are. It happened the night of my 28th birthday. We have built an everlasting friendship. I feel free around him. And like he says, he makes my heart smile. He deserves some happiness in his life. And it makes me feel good to know that I can provide him with such happiness. Who knows if anything serious will ever happen between the two of us? I only know what I dream. Ciao, AMF. So as the spring of 1994 came around, Annie was still infatuated with Tom, still engaging in an affair, and Tom was still continuously trying to win over Annie's friends. So it was around this time that Tom, or Tommy, as Annie liked to refer to him, told her to pick two of her friends, and they would all go out to a very nice lunch at a very nice restaurant named Tiffin. She chose Jill and Ginny, and both women, just like with Jackie, noticed how much, Tom was trying to, show off and impress impress them and Annie. They noticed that like during the meal and during the whole time, Tom like kept darting at Annie to like see her reaction to like, you know, the food, the prices, the atmosphere. And it was just very weird to them. But let's remember, it wasn't all sunshine and roses in Annie and Tom's relationship. Remember, I mentioned this before, we have Annie's diaries, and as such, she kept entries of their relationship ups and downs. In an entry from March of 1994, she told her diary that she and Thomas had lunch, but that, quote, "We have problems because he has a wife and children also. I don't want to be in love, but I can't help it. My God, please don't judge me." In the meantime, as she's, engaging in this affair, she's continuing to see her therapist, Bob Connor. Annie was also still struggling with her body dysmorphia and her eating disorder, and as a result, she was under eating, and it had gotten to the point where now she was just starving herself. She wrote in her diary, quote, "I am stuck at 135 pounds, and it's pissing me off." By the way, Annie was 5'10". "I can't starve myself any more than I already am. I suppose I should be thankful that I haven't gained any weight either. I still avoid situations where there is food involved. GR was making mussels marinara and linguine with shrimp and chicken tonight, but I was afraid if I went over, I would have gained a pound or two. So I declined the invitation. When I lose my last 5 pounds, I will treat myself." Ugh, it's just so heartbreaking. In fact, March 94 was actually a very tough month for Annie in general. There was some sickness going on in her family. Mark was still kind of struggling with alcoholism. I think he was in and out of like rehab and stuff. She was in love with a married man. She had said goodbye to Paul Columbus. I guess he had gone off to join the service. And like, I don't think she loved him, but they were pretty close. That was like her first real relationship. And she still remained close with the Columbus family, including Paul. So that was tough. There were couples pairing off all around her, and she just felt very lonely. On top of that, March was the anniversaries of her mother and father's deaths. And on the 8th anniversary of her father's death on March 24th, Tom had apparently made Annie an offer that she wrote in her diary about. Quote, "My boyfriend asked me today if I wanted to be a girlfriend and live alone, and he would pay rent for my room. I need to think. I love him, but he has 4 children and a wife. I will be a silent girlfriend." Oh my God. In the end, Annie refused Tom's proposal. It was said she feared being cut off from her friend group and being isolated. Like, remember, her friendships were very important to her, and some of these friends she'd had since childhood. Plus, her and her other friend, Kim Hortzman, they were going to rent a beach house on the Jersey Shore that summer. It was something they did every year. They would rent this, like, beach house with, like, 6, 7, 8, or 9 other people, and all throughout the summer, on the weekends, they would go to the Jersey Shore and hit the beach. And this was an annual tradition they did. So, everything else, plus this coming up, Annie, told Tom, "Nah, dude, I'm cool." Now, it is said Tom took this rejection quite well, and Annie totally believed that he truly wanted, whatever made her happy. So, even though Annie had a pretty remarkable job in the governor's offices, she still only took home like 30 grand a year, so she was usually living paycheck to paycheck, as were her peers. But Annie had a real passion for clothes, right? She had grown up like poverty-stricken childhood, so she was always wearing hand-me-downs and stuff. Plus now, with her job position and Tom's connections, she was attending a lot more events, and at these events, ladies were dressed in nice dresses and suits, and Annie wanted to kind of blend in. She's like, I gotta find some nice clothes for my job, essentially, right? So there was one time where Annie and Jill, it was around this time period that Annie and Jill went shopping. Annie was going to go to a wedding, so they were going to find like a nice dress for her to wear. And I'm sure she was probably trying to find a dress that she could also use to wear to some of these events, right? So they found like the most perfect dress that, you see in the movies. Oh, it fits like a glove. It looks so good on you. Like they found it, right? Like they found the dress. But Annie looked at the price tag and like her jaw dropped, right? She's like, oh, bro, we can't afford this. Like, sucks. Just like in the movies, right? So they left the shop without buying it. Later, much later, Jill asked Annie, like, oh, hey, how'd the wedding go? What'd you end up wearing? And Annie told her, like, oh, I got to wear the dress that we had at the shop. And Jill was like, oh my God, how'd you possibly afford it? Annie told her that Tom had bought it for her. And the affair with Tom continued on. And it is said during their affair, Annie just went through an entire emotional roller coaster, man. Like I said, we have her diary entries, so we can see the ups and downs. On April 22nd, Tom invited Annie over to his house for dinner. She did not mention in her diary if they had been alone or if he had come up with an excuse for her to dine with his family. Not sure. She only wrote, quote, my friend and I went to his house to eat. What a house. He enchants me. During the weekend, my thoughts are devoted to Thomas. I am afraid because I'm in love with a man who has a family. I need to realize that our relationship will never be anything other than a secret. Then, on the 26th, Tom Tom had come over to Annie's apartment and broken up with her, saying she deserved a man without a family, a man who could spend time with her because she was, quote, very special and deserved much more. She was heartbroken, blamed herself as usual, and grieved Tom in the relationship for 2 whole days before Tom called her back up, telling her that he just loved her too much. He couldn't stay away from her. And they then agreed to keep having the affair. Yeah, see the kind of like emotional manipulation that this guy does? And oh, my dudes, we have so much of this kind of behavior to go over, like, oh my god. Now, Annie ended her diary entry mentioning that Tom was going to be gone. He had a seminar that he had to go to in Montreal, Canada. Now, you're probably wondering, right? Well, okay, he's having this affair with Annie. Where's Debbie? Well, Tom was still having an affair with Debbie as well. Yeah, he was now juggling 3 women in his life: Kay, Debbie, and now Annie. Now, some have remarked that though like physically different, each one of these women was different, they did have one thing in common, and that was they always put other people's happiness and well-being above their own. That was something Kay, Debbie, and Annie all had in common. All 3 had grown up in childhood homes where alcoholism had caused them to sort of walk on eggshells and try with all of their might to please, to appease people around them. And some wonder if this was a conscious effort on Tom's behalf, if he like specifically sought out these kind of women, or if this just happened to be a coincidence. So at this point, for 12 years, Debbie had been Tom's secret affair partner. And as Tom was telling Annie how he loved her and he just couldn't stay away from her, he was still involved with Debbie, who had actually ended up growing like somewhat happy with her arrangement here. You know, like, I guess you live something long enough, no matter how bizarre, it just kind of becomes your new normal, right? And that was Debbie. She believed that Tom was grossly unhappy in her marriage. Remember, all she really had to go on between Tom and Kay's relationship is what Tom told her. Kay didn't really talk about private things. And, you know, from what Tom said, it seemed Kay was a perfectly nice person, but they just didn't have, you know, that much in common. And being as they were devoutly Catholic, divorce was just not an option. So they were just kind of stuck with each other. Tom claimed to Debbie that he couldn't be separated from his children either, which of course Debbie, being a mother herself, totally understood. And even if Debbie had been aware of Annie, I don't think she would have said anything, dude. As we will get into, as we will see, Debbie is a very good obedient lapdog. According to Debbie herself, she, quote, never rocked the boat. I always wanted to please him because I wanted his praise. I wanted him to love me. I thought that was the way I had to be for him to keep loving me. I was always afraid that he would leave me. Like I said, man, Debbie was his ever obedient dog. Even when Tom was hours late, even when he made her feel dumb or whatever, she never chastised him, never gave him an ultimatum, never anything. He would say Debbie was a, quote, doormat for people, including himself. And Debbie would just agree. She would try and talk to him about her administrative job that she had at her kid's high school, which she really enjoyed and it like meant a lot to her. But Tom would just make her feel really dumb about her job and insignificant. Told her she worked too much overtime for too little pay. And she learned to just not bring up the topic of her job with him. Additionally, though Debbie had never given Tom any ultimatums and never like had fights with him about like her status as his mistress, Tom would constantly tell Debbie that she deserved more and even encouraged and pressured her to go out with other men. Not just that, he wanted her to go out, meet with men, hook up with men, and then tell him about it. And every time he brought this up, she just felt rejected. She felt it was the ultimate rejection, that he was trying to pawn her off on other men. And actually, speaking of this topic, there were actually some incidents in their relationship that Debbie tried to block out. So one time, during the late 80s, after they had been together for a few years at that point, Tom encouraged a date between Debbie and a former classmate. This classmate was visiting in town, and at Tom's instigation and insistence, Debbie invited the classmate over. At her home, again, under Tom's insistence, a sexual encounter occurred between Debbie and the classmate. And apparently, Tom watched Debbie and the classmate have sex through a window. And about 5 years after that, there was another incident. At this incident, Tom unexpectedly showed up to Debbie's house, and he showed up with a friend. This friend was Keith Brady. He was actually the attorney who had replaced Tom as Governor Castle's chief legal counsel. Now, Tom and Keith, before they'd gone to Debbie's, they had been golfing, and they were also pretty buzzed. danced. They'd been drinking quite a bit. And once at Debbie's, Tom poured even more drinks. Now, at one point, Tom, I guess, signaled to Debbie. The two went off to a room separately and had sex. Afterwards, Tom told Debbie to do whatever she needed to do in order to draw Keith in to a sexual encounter. Debbie, because she's the good, dutiful dog, did as she was told, even though she didn't like this at all. Like, this stuff, like, made her sick to her stomach, but she wanted to please Tom, so she did as she was told. Quote, "I was afraid if I didn't do it, he'd get angry and leave. Leave me." But apparently, not sure exactly what happened, but Keith was apparently as embarrassed and uncomfortable as Debbie was, and I'm not sure exactly what happened, but like he failed to get an erection. And it was said to be a very humiliating, embarrassing experience for both Keith and Debbie. On another occasion, Tom encouraged Debbie to take Keith to lunch and try to seduce him. He wanted them to have sex, and he wanted to watch them. Now, Debbie did take Keith to lunch, but neither of them were really interested in more than that, and so that never happened. Now, Tom's sexual proclivities had always been a little unusual to Debbie, who, remember, had like little to no sexual experience prior to Tom. Remember, she was a stereotypical rich boomer. I think she had only slept with like maybe her husband, and she didn't have a lot of sexual experiences. So she always did her best to accommodate, Tom and his sexual interests, never really having any type of like tool to gauge on like if what he was asking of her was maybe a little too far. She didn't really have any type of foundation for that because she'd been so sheltered her whole life, She also wondered why Tom insisted on pushing people outside of their comfort zones. Like, he was always pushing people to do things they didn't want to do, testing their boundaries, like putting them in compromised situations. I mean, obviously, right, it had to have been a power thing. So in April of 1994, Tom, juggling his women, invited Debbie to that Montreal trip that Annie had written about in her diary. He had a law seminar to attend while up there, but he assured Debbie that they would have plenty of free time together. Now, in all of their years together, they still spoke on the phone daily, and every Wednesday was reserved just for her. But of course, they had never really like gone on trips together. He never really took her out. And when he did take her out, he would take her to like, some restaurant in Little Italy in Philadelphia, like far away from Delaware. Tom was just like obsessed with keeping their relationship a total secret. And too many people knew him in Wilmington, Like, even if they had bumped into each other like in town or whatever, like they would just have to like play it off like they were, oh yeah, like some familiar acquaintances or whatever. Like, he was obsessed with keeping a tight lid on this. In fact, Debbie had never spent 2 nights in a row with Tom, and this trip to Montreal, it was a huge deal for her. It was a huge deal for her. For once, she would know Tom wouldn't be gone in a couple of hours, that she would have, time to spend with him. But Tom told her they still would have to be discreet. They couldn't even fly together up there to Canada. They couldn't even fly in the same flight. So Tom flew up first, and then Debbie followed. Now, Debbie said that she had a wonderful time on the trip, but on the return flight home, there was some sort of like reservation mix-up, and Tom and Debbie ended up on the same flight. Tom was not happy about this, especially because there was a female lawyer who knew Tom that was also on that flight. So he made Debbie sit on like the polar opposite end of the plane. Quote, "It made me feel like, what am I doing here anyway?" And when their flight got into Philadelphia, Tom took Debbie to dinner, and, Debbie was able to remember the great weekend that they had had. However, Debbie mistakenly left her purse at the restaurant on the floor under the table where they were eating, and she didn't realize it until they were halfway back to Wilmington. It was a 30-minute drive, and they were halfway back, before, like, she realized it, and Tom was pissed. He chided her, quote, "I can't believe you could do something so stupid, so unbelievably dumb." She called the restaurant off Tom's car phone or cell phone, one of the two, and they turned around to, pick up the purse. Quote, "And I apologized profusely. By that point in our relationship, I was constantly apologizing to him about something. I was sorry. I was sorry for things that I didn't even need to be sorry for, and I was probably getting on his nerves. He made me feel like such an idiot. He was so verbally abusive that night." So not a great end to their weekend, right? Debbie felt so stupid and terrible for leaving something that could so obviously be traced back to her. Because remember, all she wanted to do was please Tom. That was like her whole life's purpose, it seemed. She probably would have felt even more horrible had she known that Tom was engaged in his affair with Annie at the same time. It never even even cross Debbie's mind that Tom would have another mistress. She thought her and Tom were closer than any married couple, that he had chosen her to have an affair with. And even though he would get angry with her, he always came back to her in the end. That was Debbie's view on their relationship. Yeah, it always cracks me up when people engage in a relationship via affair and then are shocked Pikachu face when the person that they are cheating with turns out to be a serial cheater. Like, duh. So throughout the spring of 1994, Annie continued seeing Bob Connor, and constant themes, I guess, crop up in his notes, such as, quote, codependency issues, turns to conflict to avoid depression, emotionally fragile, feels powerless, self-esteem issues, struggling with deeply held fear of abandonment, sense of aloneness, but with a core of unlovedness, so frightened of hurting others, and fear of rejection. But on the outside, as we know, she puts on this happy front, and it said, like, those who, casually knew her, maybe friends who weren't like close confidants, would have been shocked to discover that she was seeing a therapist or had these issues. She was so carefree and full of life. She had a wicked sense of humor, was so well liked. And though she couldn't see it, people thought she was a gorgeous, beautiful woman with a stunning body. But, at least Annie was trying to seek help, right? With Bob Connor's help and stuff. So that's good. She was slowly learning to assert herself with his help and was starting to believe that, she was a good person who did deserve to be happy and deserved to be loved, which is what she wanted most of all. These were just some of the changes that Annie had in this spring. Her living situation was also changing. One roommate was going to live in New Zealand. I think Jackie was going to go get married. So Annie had to now find a different place and find some place that she could afford. Her and her brother Brian were also planning a trip to Ireland. This was so they could trace their family roots, specifically their grandmas. And so far they had only saved enough for the plane fare. Now Tom, he knew all of this, and he kept trying to pay for Annie's trip on top of other things. And he offered so many other things that Annie wanted. A listener who gave her his full attention, the security and protectedness of an older man, something she had always lacked, on top of the money and wealth, right? And the security that brought. But Annie, she didn't want to become too dependent on Tom though. So she always tried to resist, though again, it was so easy for her to fall for him, even if she knew he could never offer her the things that she truly wanted. She was so fearful of hurting Tom's feelings too. But he took things so well, and so this caused an eternal struggle for her. One day she confided in Jill that Tom had sent her $500. And this was so that Annie could make a side trip to Spain when she went to Ireland. And as we know, this was somewhere she always wanted to return to, right? Now, the two of them discussed if she should use it or not. How would she explain a spontaneous side trip to Brian? What would he think? And whereas $500 was nothing to people like Tom, to people like Jill and Annie, that was a lot of money. In fact, it was just too much for Annie to accept, and she didn't accept it. As the summer approached, it was clear from Annie's diary entries that she was seriously starting to question her relationship with Tom. Her family, their approval, her Catholic faith, they were all very important to her, right? And the longer she's with Tom, the longer these things are going to conflict. But even still, she wasn't quite content on being on her own just yet. So she was still with Tom, even though she's still having this moral and ethical dilemma going on. Her diary was full of entries of dates with other men. And though Annie was 27, 28 years old when she wrote these diary entries, they come off as maybe if a teenager, like a 16, 17, 18-year-old was writing them. Remember, Annie had dated very late in life, was said to need, more approval than most people. Hence, the writing's coming off as a teen. So Annie ended up going on her trip to Ireland with her brother in the summer. And it was said overall she had a wonderful trip. It was a really good trip. And she seemed as happy as she had been in a while. But when she got back and, things slowly fizzled with, different guys, Annie always went back to Tom, who was always there to accept her. And still make constant calls and visits to her. So Annie confided in some friends about the affair with Tom and others not so much. One friend that she had confided in was Kim Hortzman. Kim was one of the few people who knew everything about Annie, including her eating disorder. At one point, Kim was the only friend that Annie had confided in the affair with Tom. So Kim was a very close confidant. Annie told Kim that Tom treated her, quote, like a princess, that she could confide in him with anything, and he often treated her to gifts and trips. Kim said, quote, I think she kind of thought of him maybe as a father figure, that she could share a lot with him. But Kim was also aware of Annie's, internal struggle with the affair. Quote, it was a very difficult situation for her because he was married with 4 children, and Annie is Catholic, and committing adultery is something that is against our religion. I mean, isn't it against, like, most religion? It was a very difficult struggle for her. Now, Tom, he was aware that Kim was one of Annie's closest friends, and was aware that Kim knew of their affair. And as such, he told Annie that he wanted to meet Kim. Now, Kim was a little taken aback and surprised when Annie told her this, but, Kim eventually agreed, and the 3 of them went out to dinner. Now, Kim really studied Tom, that when they were at dinner, she just really wanted to see, like, who is this guy that Annie is so enamored with? And she just thought it was weird, like, how Tom wanted to, because again, like he had with her other friends, it came off as Tom really wanted Kim to like him, like he was trying to impress her, and Kim just thought it was very weird and off-putting that he was sitting there trying to woo her when it was, like, obvious that he, wanted Annie. Now, as time went on, it became painfully aware to Annie that Tom had a full-on separate life from her. One encounter that really highlighted this was when Annie and a friend were shopping somewhere in town, and they ran into Tom, who was shopping with one of his daughters. And I guess the whole interaction was just very weird and awkward, and it was just kind of one of the stark reminders to Annie that, like, this is not a normal relationship that you have. He has a full-on family. So as the year transitioned into autumn, the bright spot that was Annie's Ireland trip really seemed to fade away. This time of year was always rough for her because it was the anniversary of her grandmother's death. But I guess it was even rougher this particular year because of her work. She felt like she wasn't really taken seriously at work, that her ideas weren't really, like, seriously considered. And it was just getting very frustrating for her. On top of that, she hadn't got a hard-earned raise due to, like, some sort of budget allocation. So it was just not a very good time. Annie was also still struggling with her weight, and by the fall, she had become so thin that her friends thought, like, her arms and legs were, like, sticking out, and they, like, were just like, girl, you do not look good. And then one time when they're at the supermarket, Annie and Jill were at the supermarket, and Jill saw that Annie had nothing but, like, fruit in her cart, and Jill just, like, with tears in her eyes and very emotional, like, told Annie, like, I'm so worried about you. And it is said, Annie didn't avoid the topic, but she just assured her friend, also with tears in her eyes, was very emotional, quote, don't worry about me. I'll stick around for a long time. Now, Jill wanted to call Bob Connor because she didn't understand how, like, a therapist could sit here and, like, have a client that is so obviously struggling with an eating disorder. But in actuality, Bob was well aware of Annie's eating disorder and her struggle with it, but he was hesitant to really bring it up and push the subject until Annie brought it up. Apparently, like, that's the thing with anorexics. Apparently, you really have to wait for them to come to you, and the more you force them to eat, the more you pressure them to eat, the more that they don't want to, right? So Bob was well aware that Annie had a problem, but he also knew that he had to wait for her to be in the right place to bring it up and actually deal with it, right? But Annie did continue to make progress with him. She was, she had gained a lot of trust and confidence in Bob since she was so guarded with her emotions and trust and felt easily abandoned. She felt that Bob was a good listener, good emotional support for her to lean on. She told him how she feared the upcoming holidays. She worried if there was going to be alcohol at a family gathering that her brother Mark was going to be at and what would happen with that. She was worried about all the food that she would have to, like, not eat, but, like, pretend to eat and push around her plate and, like, eat enough so that people wouldn't ask her questions. And she confided in Bob that she was seeing a lawyer. But so far, that's all she would say. It is said being in this affair with Tom was very destructive and frightening for Annie, not just because of her fear of abandonment issues and all that, but because she just didn't want to disappoint or anger anyone, such as her family or her God or Tom. Remember, she's a people pleaser, and so she's kind of like stuck between a rock and a hard place. And didn't help that, I mentioned this earlier, Tom just really wormed his way into Annie's life. He knew what her weaknesses were, what her vulnerabilities were. She had really opened up to him. He often told her how hurt he was when she rejected him. And intellectually, Annie knew that she couldn't have Tom, couldn't have a family with him, and just couldn't have, like, a normal, happy, healthy relationship with him. But emotionally, even though she tried not to, Annie grew to need him, to depend on him, just like Tom had done with Debbie. Now, going into the new year of 1995, Annie was engaged in cognitive therapy with Bob, and she was making, like I said, some progress. She had grown really close to him. Unfortunately, they would only have 2 sessions in January, the 5th and the 17th. On her next scheduled appointment, which was January 24th, Bob called her the day of and was like, hey, I've got a patient in crisis that I really want to attend to. Can I give them your time slot? And Annie, of course, was like, yeah, of course you can. Like, she had been that patient in crisis many, many times. So she had no qualms at all about handing over her appointment time. Well, turns out, that appointment went extra long. So Bob left the offices much later than he normally would have. And on his way home, a drunk driver crossed over the barrier and collided with Bob in a head-on collision that killed him. Annie was devastated at this loss, crushed. She had been seeing Bob since 1992 at this point, had come to trust him, view him as maybe like a father or a brother figure, and because of her self-loathing, she of course blamed herself for his death. Quote, if I hadn't said it was okay to postpone my session, he wouldn't have been out on that road so late. He would have been in his office at 5 with me, as always, and he would have just gone home, like always. She actually wouldn't write in her diary about the loss of Bob for a month. Quote, I loved Bob, and he has helped me grow so much, but we had a lot more work to do until I got to where I need to be in this point in my life. He was the only person who knew everything, even a little bit about Tommy, not much, about me, and it felt great to get all this shit inside of me out, and she capitalized out. Bob was funny, intelligent, had a great smile, voice, and sense of humor. He believed in me and actually liked me for me. Not many people know the real Annie. Bob had actually died 2 days before Annie's 29th birthday, and Ginny, Jill, and Jackie, they were, planning to take her out, and they asked her like, hey, do you, still want to go out for your birthday? And Annie was like, yeah, I do. And so they agreed that they would all meet up at Ginny's house and then go out to eat. But Annie ended up being a half hour late to Ginny's. She informed them that Tom had stopped by her apartment with a surprise birthday gift, a brand new 27-inch television. Tom had told her that he really liked TV. He had one in every room in his house. And he thought that the set that her sister had given her was, quote, cheap and chintzy. Now, her friends weren't exactly thrilled that Tom was back in her life. Throughout the year of 1994, even though Annie and Tom were engaged in an affair, she did manage to kind of distance herself from him. Remember we talked about she went on different dates with guys and stuff, and as they would fizzle, there would be Tom right there to, gather her in his arms. So they were really hoping that maybe she was distancing, but yeah, at this revelation, they weren't too thrilled. But, they know she was going through a hard time at this point. It was her birthday, and they just didn't feel like lecturing her at that point. So after Bob's death, not only was it devastating, she now had to find a new therapist, which, as we know, it's not like, switching mechanics or something, right? It had taken her a long time to find a therapist that she could connect with and trust. And now she had to start all over. And of course, it wasn't going to be easy to find another person like Bob. But of course, who do you think was there in the meantime? That's right, Tom. He would often tell Annie how miserable he was, the sacrifices he made so his family could be happy, the pressures he had to deal with, and Annie, being who she is, always worried about him. And much like with Debbie, Annie was really touched at the loneliness that Tom said that he felt, and she felt he deserved to be happy. And now he was listening to her problems and her confidences, and seemed to be so worried for her. And yeah, this dog and pony show, man, just really worked on Annie. Let's remember how vulnerable she was. Not to mention, let's remember, emotionally speaking and romantically, Annie's more like a 16-year-old. She experienced a lot of childhood trauma and rejection, hadn't really started dating until much later in life. Tom was so much older, much more experienced. He had so much power and sway and wealth that it was so easy for him to play this game on her, guys. It was so easy. Now, Annie didn't know Kay, only the cold woman that Tom described, and she knew nothing at all about Debbie, and vice versa. So 4 days after Valentine's Day in 1995, Tom called Annie up and told her about a party he was throwing for a friend. It was for Buddy Friel. Now, the Friels actually knew the Faheys quite well, and they also knew the Capanos quite well. Annie had grown up a lot with the Friels, and she knew Buddy Friel. And so yeah, Tom had called her up and said, yeah, we're gonna go through a birthday party at Buddy Friel's, and then we're gonna go to the Friels, Irish pub and, hang out there, continue the party there. Now, Tom did not invite Annie to this bar, but he didn't tell her to stay away either. So Annie decided, I'm going to surprise him at the bar. And so she went with a couple of friends. But when she, saw Tom there at the bar with Kay, who looked perfectly warm and lovely and seemed very cheery and friendly, it struck Annie yet again, just really hard smack in the face, just how unavailable Tom was. What's worse is Tom saw her and he shot Annie the most venomous, hateful, spiteful look. He had never before been angry with Annie, so this was new. Annie had been really naive and thought she could just sit across the bar from Tom and just kind of have, a good hangout with her friends. But Tom was glaring such nasty daggers at her, and seeing how familiar and loving he was with Kay, it was all just too much for Annie, and she ended up leaving with her friends. And when Tom didn't phone her over the next 2 days after that, she phoned him, and he was very curt and short with her. He just told her, quote, I have a very busy week, and everything in my life is wrong, and my life sucks. Aw, this poor widow witch boy's life sucks. Get the fuck Get out of here, dude. And he just ended up hanging up on her. So remember, Debbie learned this lesson too. This is the same behavior he's exhibiting. Remember, only Tom was to be in control of his affairs, and he would not have his women stepping out of line. That is how Tom operated. And let's remember, Tom knows all of Anne's insecurities. He knows she fears rejection, abandonment, and just wants to please people. And of course, he used all of these to his advantage. So Annie kept trying to call Tom, but he just ghosted her. He actually went a week without calling her. And in her diary during that week, Annie was of course blaming herself, berating herself. She wrote, quote, "Why did I allow myself to fall in love with a married man? I know exactly why. Tom is kind, caring, responsive, loving, has a beautiful heart, is extremely handsome, and was kind and gentle with me. If he loves me like he used to say, which I still believe he does, then why is he treating me like this? The most difficult part of this relationship is the fact that I cannot talk to anyone about us. The only person that knows is T, and he is not talking to me. Hopefully soon, the phone will ring." Now, after a week, Tom did call, but when he did call, he sounded so depressed that Annie was fearful he had a terminal illness or was going to commit suicide or something. And of course, Tom would neither confirm nor deny these things. She was so worried, she even went to St. Anthony's Church to pray for him. Yeah, this guy is a class A douche. Then, 10 days after the bar incident, Tom finally called Annie and told her that he needed to speak with her. And oh my God, y'all, the dramatic play that this fool puts on here. Let me tell you. So when they met, Tom told her that they just had no future together. Even though he loved her so much, he told her that the problem was his feelings for her were so strong that he was jealous when a man looked at her, said anything to her. Tom kissed her and held her and shed that single man tear before he told her he had to let her go. For her own sake and for her future. He even made a show of forcing himself to walk away. An actual show of it, guys. This was like a soap opera scene come to life. And again, because he knows exactly what he is doing, knows exactly what Annie's fears are, and knows exactly who his audience is, this whole performance worked like a charm. Annie would write in her diary, quote, "My life doesn't exist without Thomas. He deserves happiness. He deserves not to be miserable. I'll wait forever. He's a wonderful, kind, caring, generous, sensitive man who deserves to be showered with the same kind of generosity that he gives. I want to be that person." Now, as springtime was coming around, Annie's friends noticed that it was getting harder and harder to schedule time with Annie. And another thing, whereas before Tom went out of his way, in a cringy fashion, to get Annie's friends to like him, as springtime dawned, it seemed Tom was instead trying to drive a wedge between Annie and her friends. On St. Patrick's Day, which was a huge holiday in this area, Annie and Jill had plans to go to a pub. Jill was over at Annie's apartment as she was getting ready when the phone rang. Surprise, surprise, it was Tom. Annie apologized to Jill and told her that she had to leave because she had to go see Tom. He was having a rough time, and he really needed someone to talk to. Annie told Jill that she would call her in 30 to 40 minutes, and then they could go out. So Jill left, and Annie called her back 45 minutes later. She told Jill that Tom was having problems in his marriage, and he just needed someone to talk to. The girls did go to the pub that night, but after that, Annie's friends noticed how Tom always seemed to have some kind of emergency or some kind of something that needed Annie's attention right away whenever they had plans. It came off to them as if Tom didn't want Annie having friends, and they felt that he certainly didn't want her to go out and have a good time. When the Tour de Pont bicycle races came to town, once again, Annie had plans with friends, including Jill, and they were going to go to a lot of the events going on. On the night they were to go out, Annie told Jill and her other friends that she couldn't go. She had a job interview. Now, Jill was shocked at this. She's like, "I didn't even know you were looking for another job." Annie said, "Well, I wasn't, but it's a personal assistant job for someone in North Wilmington." She told him that she would get the same salary, but an apartment would be provided for her, so no rent. I don't know about utilities. Now, Jill, though, seemed off to her, and she kept, asking Annie, again, in a very, kind of non-pressured way. She knew how Annie operated, and eventually, Annie confessed that the job interview was with Louis Capano Jr. She told Jill that she had to go to this job interview. Tom had gone to such lengths and to such trouble to secure it for her. She told her friends to go on without her, and she'd catch up with them later. 5 hours later, Jill and Annie's other friends came across Annie wearing jeans, her eyes bright red and puffy from crying. She said she didn't want to talk about the interview, and elaborately explained that she'd just been crying over Bob's death. And I'm not sure if her friends really bought that excuse. The next night, over a drink with Jill, Annie finally confided, quote, "I think he wants to control me." And Jill asked if she meant Louis Capano Jr., Tom's brother? And Annie said, quote, "No. Tom. If I took the job, it would be Tom who was controlling where I worked and where I lived. Everything. And Jill was really struck with how many times the word control came up in their conversation. And she was really getting worried at what Annie was describing here. So whereas a normal job, right? Clock in, clock out, and then once you clock out, right, that time is yours, right? Well, from what Annie described, Tom would control every second of her day. Yeah, pretty creepy. After the drink, the two separated to dress for some cocktail party that they were going to go to. But when Jill called Annie to be like, hey, I'm on my way to pick you up, Annie didn't answer. Quote, I kept calling and I got to the point where I was angry. Like, we had plans. But I was concerned too, and I called every 15 minutes. Annie never returned those calls. The next day, Jill, who was now working in the campaign office, so saw Tom quite regularly because he was on the Democratic fundraising committee, called Tom up the next morning on the pretense of campaign business and just casually asked if hey, have you seen Anne that morning? And he said, quote, she left for the beach very early this morning. So it was very clear that though she was struggling and starting to get a little worried with Tom's behavior, Annie was fully entrenched in this affair with Tom. In her view, she was the only thing that kept him from falling into a pit of despair. She couldn't desert him. She didn't want to hurt him. If he was sometimes possessive or unreasonable with her, she blamed it on all the burdens he carried. He had so much pressure on him that, yeah, of course he was going to take it out on those around him. While everyone else saw this strong, powerful man, she knew that he was really a man in pain. He conveyed this to her often, especially when Annie did something he disapproved of. He didn't like her stuffy little apartment and constantly told her that she could have a real nice one if she took that job with his brother. He told her how to dress. He didn't like her wearing clothing that was too red, too bright, too tight, or too short. He would tell her, quote, you look like a whore when you dress like that. And remember, I've mentioned this I think a few times now, Tom knew Annie's insecurities, knew about her body dysmorphia. He knew that she felt that her legs were fat, that her breasts were too big, knew that she starved herself, especially when she was frightened or stressed, knew about her childhood and her trauma, and he often used these to his advantage. He started telling her negative things about her friends. He disapproved of them, and he didn't understand why she needed to spend so much time with them anyway. After all, didn't he take her to nice places? Nicer places than her friends could ever dream of? And yeah, he did take her to some nice fancy places, always ordering the wine and entrees for them, and always sliding the check over to Annie so that she could sign for it and fill out the tip, even though it was his card and he was paying for it. And it was said that he did this so that she would know how much he spent. And he was well aware how much Annie hated eating because of her eating disorder, but Tom didn't care. He liked going out to eat. So, as summer approached, Annie made her annual plans with Kim to rent a beach house on the Jersey Shore. Remember, we mentioned this was an annual tradition that they had done going back years. But as they were making their plans this year, Annie confided in Kim that she was worried because Tom would not want her staying in a house that, had other men in it. Remember, they would rent this house with 6, 7, 8, or 9 other people, men, women, all included. Some of them would go out to the shore, some would stay inside, you know what I mean? It was like a big communal living thing. And she was afraid Tom, wouldn't want her living in a house with other men. Quote, I think he would be very much against that. And it is said when Annie told her this, Kim just kind of stared at her in disbelief and was like, Are you for real? They've been doing this for years now, right? They'd never had a problem. They'd always had a great time. And so Kim was like, are you for real? Annie eventually admitted that Tom, quote, flat out, told her that he didn't want her in any house on the shore. But despite Annie's fears that Tom would disapprove, Annie and Kim made their usual plans. However, it was the worst summer ever at the shore. So though they had arranged to rent this summer house with 7 or 8 other people, it is said that summer Annie and Kim rarely went. And Kim admitted that neither her or Annie were really all that comfortable at the house. These were complete strangers they were renting with. I believe in years prior, there was some kind of degree of separation with people they'd rented the house from. It was friend of a friend of a friend or friend of a family or whatever, you know what I mean? But this time they were all complete strangers. And so Kim did admit that, that did make them uncomfortable. But according to Kim, that wasn't the real reason why the summer of 95 was the worst yet at the shore. She said it was because of Tom, or Capano, as Kim referred to him as. She never used the Mr., and she always refused to address him by Tom. She would just call him Capano. So Kim said, quote, we were not that comfortable in that house because we didn't know any of the other people. But also, there were fights about it between Capano and Annie. They would fight because she was going to this house at the shore, and we didn't know where we would be sleeping, or if we would be sleeping on the floor. And there were 5 or 6 single guys at the house. So it was always a problem for her because she was given a hard time from Capano. know. But, the two friends were determined to use it at least once. I mean, they had paid for it for the summer. They were at least going to have one fun weekend. And they planned to do that the first week of June. So they're going to meet at a mutual friend's house at noon and then head to the shore. Kim said, quote, "She wasn't there at 1 and she wasn't there at 2. And I kept calling her and would get her answering machine. And finally, at maybe 4 or 5, she called me at the Ford's house to say that Capano had just left and that they had had a huge fight because he didn't want her to go to the shore. And he brought over wine and salmon and things for her apartment. And then this fight ensued and she was too exhausted to make the trip." Kim tried to understand where Annie was coming from in all this. And though she wanted to tell her friend to run for the hills, get away from this guy, quote, she was in love with him, but she was confused. Remember, Annie knew because Tom was married with 4 children, the relationship could never really go anywhere. She also knew how much Tom loved and adored his children and knew that in his eyes, she was always going to be number 2. And the age difference was also becoming a problem. Now that Tom was slowly encircling Annie and slowly attempting to isolate her more and more from her friends, Annie was able to see how little they actually had in common. He wasn't interested in hanging out with Annie's friends, and frankly, she kind of found that hard to even imagine. And Tom tried so hard to be in sync with what was cool with the young crowd that it just came off as cringe, and it just kind of came off as hello, fellow children, and it was just very cringe. And it was just very obvious that they were from 2 different generations. And to top it off, Annie knew how disappointed and upset her family would be if they knew about her affair. But though she knew the cons of this relationship, Tom kept pressuring her and pressing her to forget about everyone else but him, that he could open doors for her, offer her anything in the world. Yeah, except for marriage and a real relationship, right, Tom? Kim described it as Tom, quote, buying her. He was explaining to her what he could offer her in this life. He could offer her anything she wanted. So that confused her about the social status and whether this was something she really wanted, having the comfort level of not having to worry about money anymore. And this right here would be an especially confusing point for Annie. Remember, she'd grown up in poverty, instability, was always worried about money. And the fact that she wouldn't have to worry about that aspect of her life if she chose to be with Tom really confused her and just really messed with her both emotionally and mentally. And just like he was with Debbie, Tom was hot and cold depending on his mood, depending on if Annie did anything to upset him or please him. When she was good, he would, listen to her sympathetically, telling her all the sweet words that she needed to hear. But when she displeased him, it said he could be, quote, as cold as death. But then again, when Tom was nice, he was very nice and very generous. So in the late summer, Jackie, who was now Jackie Steinoff, had hoped to open a coffee place that she wanted to call Java Jack's. She wanted to serve breakfast and lunch 5 days a week to the local business community that she was going to set up in, and she wanted to do some catering. But she had no idea how to start this process, legally speaking, what she would have to file for and all that stuff. She had no idea. So Annie just happened to mention this to Tom casually, one day, and Tom was like, "Hey, let's set up a meeting with you and Jackie, and I'll sit down and give her all kinds of advice and stuff. I'll point her in the right direction." And so that's what happened. So at this lunch with Annie and Jackie, Tom gave thousands of dollars worth of legal advice and paperwork to Jackie, even doing the paperwork for incorporation free of charge. He gave her advice on the menu, the risks on opening a small business, gave her his opinion on what equipment she should use, and just on and on and on. He even promised to send her some catering business with his law firm since they were located right where she wanted to be. Now, while Jackie was eternally thankful for Tom's help, she was a little put off by how much he took over. Quote, "When I opened in August, he was adamant about it. He wanted to be the first customer. He wanted to come down and set up a time to go over my books," which I felt was a little odd, a little invasion of my privacy. But she also remembered how helpful he had been, and she just, chalked it up that that's just Tom being Tom, right? He just obviously has an issue with personal boundaries, especially when it comes to young women, and yeah, even though he's kind of annoying, he helped me a lot, and so yeah, it's just Tom being Tom. And she never did let him look at her books, by the way. But the one behavior Tom did exhibit when he saw Jackie, he would go into Java Jack's every single morning. The one behavior he always exhibited that Jackie hated was when he would come in, he would give her a kiss on the lips. Yeah. How some people do the, "Oh, like kiss on the cheeks or something or a hug, Tom would straight up kiss her on the lips. And Jackie would try to be in like, compromised situations when he came in. So like, she wouldn't be busy, maybe her hands full or something. But Tom always managed to land a kiss on her. I know. Oh my God. That's so inappropriate. No, I would not be okay with that. I would not be okay with that. I don't even like when people hug me. Like, I don't even like being touched. Like, oh, hell no. I don't care what the hell you've done for me. Now, as the summer wore on and Tom's pressure on Annie mounted, Annie gathered up the strength to see a new therapist, Gary Johnson. But remember, she was starting over from scratch, so it'd be quite some time before she could really open up to him, especially open up to him about the affair. Meanwhile, Tom kept tabs on Annie, always wanting to know where she was, like every minute of the day, guys. Like every single minute of her day, he wanted accounted for. And if he couldn't get a hold of her, he would call Kim or Jill or Jackie or Ginny or any number of Annie's friends to check up on her. And to Annie, who remember, is extremely private and reserved, this right here, the like calling to check up on her and then calling her friends to ask about her, really grated on Annie's nerves. This really set her off. And in July, Tom discovered email. Thus, yet another way for him to keep track of Annie. He began sending her emails from his law office email, and he would send them to her email at the governor's office. His first email to her took 6 days for Annie to respond, and she replied in a very short, curt manner. He would email her trivia questions, which she usually answered correctly, and like other light stuff. And all of them seemed, pretty lighthearted in tone and in nature. That is, unless Annie didn't respond fast enough. And on top of his phone calls, his surprise drop-ins to her at work, at her apartment, and their dates, emailing Annie was just another way for Tom to keep tabs on her and keep track of her. He had no idea that the life of an email extended beyond the send button. He had no idea that emails could be traced or received either. Yeah, and this will be something to keep in mind as we end part 1. Yes, we're finally done with part 1. And yeah, this is just part 1, guys. There's so much more to get into. Like, what do you think about this relationship between Tom and Annie? Like, wild, man. Like, I was reading this book and I was just like, oh my God, like, girl, no, you deserve so much more. Like, don't fall for his BS. But then at the same time, because of all her emotional issues and how she was, can totally see why a D-bag like that could so easily worm his way into Annie's life and manipulate her, right? Oh my gosh. We've got so much more to get into, guys. We'll be back next week for part 2, and we will really get into Tom's obsessive controlling behavior with Annie. Like, oh, I haven't even gotten to the good juicy stuff yet. Like, it's wild. And remember, as we go through this is like a 50-year-old man who's acting like this. Pretty wild. Yeah. Thank you again, Tyler Manter, for sending me down this wild hole. Like, wow. And remember, I am using Anne Rule's book And Never Let Her Go as the bulk information for the case. It is an extremely great book. I highly recommend, dude. Like, after reading this, I totally get why Anne Rule is, has the reputation among the true crime community that she does. Like, damn. Alrighty, y'all. I will let you go. We will end the first case of December. We'll be back next week with part 2 as we dive more into this case. And until we meet again next week for another crime dive, I hope you take care of yourself out there. Stay safe. I hope your holiday season is off to a fantastic start. And remember, when you're out there, you're doing your shopping or just your day-to-day life, remember, man, don't be a dick. Just don't be an a-hole, all right? Like, come on, dude. Shit's tough all over. You just don't need to be an a-hole. Alrighty, I will go ahead and let y'all go. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.